Okay, maybe I think we have enough to kind of get started here. So good morning. Welcome to our public workshop for the Zero-Emission Forklift Rulemaking. For those of you counting, this will be our fourth public meeting to discuss the development of this regulatory proposal. As always, thank you for joining us. Your feedback is important, and we're extremely appreciative of the time and effort all of you have made to participate today. We have a lot to cover, so I'm just going to quickly introduce the CARB team before we get started. So my name is David Chen. I'm a section manager here at the California Resources Board, and I'm overseeing this regulatory development effort. My supervisor, Kim Rogalski, is also online, and so is Keith Roderick, the staff lead for this effort. We also have a couple of folks from our emissions inventory team here. Nancy Bui, she's the staff lead for the large spark ignition equipment emissions inventory. And she'll be providing an update on the inventory model at the end of this workshop. Her supervisor, Corey Palmer, is also in attendance to participate in the discussion. I also have a number of other CARB folks online to assist with meeting logistics, so hopefully this goes smoothly. My team is still relatively new to Zoom, so please bear with us if we should happen to kind of run into any technical difficulties. So with that, I'm just going to hand it off to Keith Roderick, who will be giving our presentation today. So take it away, Keith.
Actually, before Keith hops in, I just wanted to say a few words. So Kim Rogalski here. Thanks everyone for taking time to attend this. We definitely will do a much better job on this rulemaking if people share their opinions and ideas with us. And we've had a really fruitful exchange so far, and we hope that continues. If any of you view this and you see any of our proposals and you prefer to speak to us privately, please reach out. We're very happy to meet with any affected parties or industry groups privately as well, as hear your thoughts inside this workshop. Thanks a lot.
Hello, I'm Keith Roderick. Next slide, please. Here's the meeting logistics, a meeting agenda for today. We will first go over the meeting logistics, give a status update on the regulation, then discuss the goals that we would like to accomplish during the workshop. Next, we will review the background reasons for the proposed zero-emission forklift regulation, followed by a discussion on the proposed regulation concept. Then, questions and comments covering the first part of the presentation will be taken. In addition, we have calculated preliminary estimates for emission reductions and statewide costs, which we will talk about and go over a couple of possible return on investment scenarios staff has developed. We would like to get your feedback on the proposals, including some new ideas, let you know what our next steps will be, and finish the presentation with questions and comments. Although not indicated here on the agenda, following the discussion on the zero-emission forklift rulemaking, staff from our emission inventory team will provide a short presentation on the spark ignited or LSI, spark ignition, or LSI equipment emission inventory. Also, for future reference, this meeting is being recorded. The presentation and meeting notes can be found by going to the Zero-Emission Forklift website. The link to the website is shown on this slide. The main documents can also be found by going to CARB's main webpage and searching for forklift. You will also find material we presented at previous meetings, including earlier versions of our draft regulatory concept. Questions and comments will be taken at the conclusion of the presentation and also in the middle. Written comments can be made by opening the Q&A window in Zoom and typing in your question. Staff will read the questions to the audience and verbally answer the question. If you are commenting on a particular slide, please include the page number of the slide so that staff can locate the slide quickly. If you want to make verbal comments, use the raise hand feature on Zoom and your name will be added to the speaking queue. If you're calling into the workshop on a phone, Press the pound key, then press the 2 key to raise and lower your hand. This workshop will be the 4th public meeting staff has had for the rulemaking. The first zero-emission workshop was held on October 7th, 2020, and was followed by 2 working group meetings held on August 17th, 2021, and February 22nd, 2022. CARB staff released the last public draft of the regulatory language in July of 2022, and staff is still working on the latest regulatory language draft. We are currently on track to present the regulation to the board in September of 2023, and at this point, we do not expect to have another workshop before the board hearing. The Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment, or SRIA, will be posted to the California Department of Finance website no later than April 7th, 2023. The SRIA is a preliminary cost assessment required for all major regulations, which are regulations that have an anticipated cost impact of over $50 million in 1 year. An updated cost assessment based on the final proposed regulation, along with the full regulatory proposal package, will be posted to the Zero-Emission website in early August. CARB staff would like to get feedback on the proposed regulatory concept, which would include hearing proposals for alternative approaches that could achieve similar emission reductions. As the agenda indicated, for stakeholders' review and input, the presentation has a few slides that present preliminary estimates for emission reductions and cost, along with estimated return on investment for a couple of different scenarios. CARB staff has made many changes to the proposed regulation based on the feedback that stakeholders have provided, and staff encourages continued stakeholder participation in the rulemaking process. CARB is developing the proposed regulation to reduce air pollutants such as nitrogen oxides, reactive organic gas, particulate matter, and greenhouse gas. This measure is included in both the 2016 and 2020 state strategies for the implementation plan, for the state implementation plan, which identifies emission reduction strategies that are needed to reduce air pollutants to meet the federal air quality standards, as well as the 2016 and 2020 mobile source strategies, which lay out actions needed to deliver broad environmental and public health benefits, including modernizing and upgrading transportation infrastructure, enhance system-wide efficiency in mobility options, and promote clean economic growth in the mobile sector. In addition, deploying zero-emission technology supports the Governor's Executive Order N-7920, which directs state agencies to achieve 100% zero emission from off-road vehicles and equipment operations in the state by 2035. Although California has made significant improvements in its air quality over the years, the state still has some of the worst air quality in the nation, with disadvantaged communities in particular being disproportionately burdened by unhealthy air. Over the last few decades, CARB has set targets to cut emissions caused by internal combustion engines to reduce the associated cancer risks statewide. The resulting strategies covered vehicles and equipment under CARB's control or influence. Additional reductions of NOx and PM 2.5 emissions are needed to both protect the health of impacted communities throughout the state and to reach the 2031 and 2037 air quality attainment targets. California also has a goal to combat climate change with the final target to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045 and a zero carbon electricity grid within the same time frame. Many strategic midterm targets have been set along the way to help us reach these targets, and today's proposed concept will keep us on track to meet these essential milestones. This slide presents a description of forklift classes as defined by the Occupational Health and Safety Administration's Industrial Truck Classification System. Class 1 through 3 include forklift types powered by an electric powertrain. A Class 1 forklift is a common indoor forklift. A Class 2 forklift is a narrow aisle forklift typically used in logistics warehouses. And Class 3 forklift is a powered pallet jack. Class 4 through Class 7 covers internal combustion industrial trucks. Class 4 refers to forklifts with cushion tires, which are typically used indoors, while Class 5 refers to forklifts with pneumatic tires and tend to be more suitable for outdoor use. In addition, Class 7 forklifts or rough terrain forklifts are specialized forklifts designed for use in rugged environments. Class 6 represents a category of forklifts, equipment called tow tractors. They are not forklifts, but I just want to mention them because they are included in OSHA's industrial truck classification system. However, they are not considered by this proposed regulation. Staff estimates that there are roughly 79,000 Class 1 and Class 2 forklifts operating in California today, primarily indoors. There are a lot of benefits of using zero-emission technology, but from a business standpoint in particular, electric forklifts are less costly to maintain and operate. Electric forklifts have been prevalent in the material handling industry for decades, with lead-acid batteries being the most common battery technology used so far. In 2018, an Industrial Truck Association publication stated that 46% of forklifts that are in operation were electric. However, this is not a significant increase from the 36% that were estimated in 1994. The industry has been moving slowly towards increasing usage of electric forklifts. That being said, today there are more forklifts in operation than ever. Demonstrations have shown that electric forklifts can be designated to lift very large lift capacities. In addition, technology advancements with advanced lead-acid batteries, AC motors, hydraulic system, and lithium batteries have made electric forklifts suitable for many applications that previously were only suited for LSI forklifts. Fuel cells are another source of zero-emission technology available for forklifts. There are over 25,000 that have been deployed in the US. They offer the advantage of quick refueling and have been deployed by many large fleets. I will now describe our draft regulatory concept. I will indicate how the updated concept differs from what was previously published, where that applies. The proposed regulation applies to affected forklifts, which are defined as either a Class 4 or Class 5 forklift with an LSI engine and has a lift capacity of 12,000 pounds or less. To give you an idea of the number of forklifts that could be affected by the regulation, CARB estimates that the forklift fleet size of Class 4 and Class 5 forklifts in California is about 95,000. Our last discussion document, we defined a lift capacity as being based on ANSI and ITSDF B56.1 as recommended by the stakeholders. However, because forklifts can have several lift capacity ratings depending upon the load center and attachment, staff is proposing to use the lowest rated lift capacity that is printed on the forklift data plate as the item to identify the lift capacity. Using the forklift data plate will allow easy identification of forklifts that will be affected by the regulation. This is a list of exempted equipment and applications. At this point, we have not made any changes to the proposed exemption list for the latest draft proposal. Specifically, The excluded forklifts are rough terrain forklifts, military tactical vehicles, pallet jacks, forklifts with telescoping booms, forklifts owned and operated by facilities subjected to the mobile cargo handling equipment at ports and intermodal rail yards regulation, forklifts subject to the in-use off-road diesel regulation. In other words, diesel forklifts. The proposed regulation would apply to forklift fleet operators, both public and private, dealers, rental companies, and forklift manufacturers. I would also like to clarify who is a fleet operator. A fleet operator is someone who owns one or more effective forklifts. The proposed regulation would be composed of two main parts: a restriction on the acquisition of new affected forklifts and a phase out of the existing affected forklifts. Specifically, fleet operators would not be able to purchase new affected forklifts, that is, LSI forklifts with a lift capacity of 12,000 pounds or less, starting in 2026. Then by the beginning of 2028, all 2025 model year and older affected forklifts would start to be phased out of the fleet. One new change staff has made is to allow fleet operators to purchase used affected forklifts, providing the forklift model year has not been phased out yet by the proposed regulation. Next, we will discuss the proposed fleet operator phase-out requirements. This slide is a review of the previous proposed phase-out requirements for fleet operators. The fleet operator would be required to phase out Class 4 affected forklifts that are 10 model years old and older, starting in 2026. For Class 5 affected forklifts, the phase-out schedule would be extended by 3 years so that the affected forklifts would be 13 model years old and older when they are phased out. Every year, the phase-out schedule would roll to the next year on January 1st. To give fleet operators more flexibility for phasing out their fleet, the current concept combines several years of the phase-out schedule together, as the next slide will show. In this slide, we show how, in response to your feedback, we've adjusted the reg concept. This slide only covers Class 4 forklifts. Class 5 are covered in the next slide. The second column of this table shows the phase-out schedule for Class 4 forklifts under the previous reg concept. The third and last column show the phase-out schedule under the grouped model year approach. The third column covers large fleets, which are fleets with 26 or more affected forklifts and zero-emission forklifts combined. Under the grouped model year approach, and the last column covers small fleets and agricultural fleets of any size under the grouped model year approach. First, I'd like to point out the delay in turnover start date compared to the previous regulation concept. We wanted to be sensitive to infrastructure issues and other challenges such as those that would be faced by older fleets. So as an example, you can see that for large fleets, the phase-out schedule was originally proposed to begin in 2026, but now we are proposing 2028, and the next phase-out date isn't until 2031. Small fleets in ag were offering an additional year of delay for a total delay of 3 years from the previous proposal. Also, for small and ag fleets, instead of phasing out a 10-year-old Class 4 affected forklift, we are now proposing to start phasing out 13-year-old forklifts instead. This slide covers the regulation phase-out concept specifically for Class 5 forklifts. Similar to the last slide, the phase-out schedule from the previous regulation concept is shown in the second column. The phase-out schedule for the grouped model year approach is covered in the last column. Also similar to the last slide, we've delayed the phase-out start dates in this case by 4 years to provide greater flexibility and to be more sensitive to the infrastructure issues. Also, note that the phase out isn't triggered until the forklift is 13 years old, which is unchanged from the previous draft concept. The group model year phase out isn't the whole story though. It is important for fleets to work on charging infrastructure early in the process so that they can be ready to meet the phase out schedule. With the group model year phase out approach, we need a mechanism to ensure that fleet operators are working on getting infrastructure in place during the time before the phase out compliance date. Our proposal is to require that fleet operators provide CARB with documentation that they have initiated infrastructure planning with the utility provider by the start date of 2026. In addition, the fleet operator would have to provide annual updates on the phase out progress. Some of the reasons that we believe the group model phase out will provide fleet operators with some flexibility are there would be additional lead time to get charging infrastructure installed at the facility. Fleet operators would have several model years to choose from when deciding which forklifts to phase out. It would give fleet operators more time to make zero-emission forklift acquisitions. The new approach could provide opportunities to reduce reporting requirements in the proposal, which staff is currently looking at. Now, we will discuss compliant extension concepts. Some of the extensions have already been presented in the past proposal and some are new. The first extension I will discuss is the product delay compliance extension. This extension is intended to help fleets operators stay in compliance when extra lead time is needed for acquiring a zero-emission forklift due to delays caused by forklift manufacturers and/or supply chain issues. This would only apply to issues outside the control of the fleet operator and not the supply chain issues influenced by or caused by the fleet operator. The fleet operator would have to supply CARB with documentation from the manufacturer and/or forklift dealer proving the issue and stating the expected delivery date. Some of the proposed conditions for the product delay compliance extension include the purchase order for the zero-emission forklift must have been placed at least 1 year before the compliance date, and a copy of the purchase order must be provided with the extension request. The fleet operator must provide an explanation and documentation substantiating the delivery delay. CARB must receive notification of any changes in the scheduled delivery date within 30 days of the fleet operator being notified by the forklift or component dealer. With respect to the duration of the extension, staff's current thinking is 1 year by default, which is what was indicated on the previous regulatory concept published last July. I will now talk about staff's current thinking on an infrastructure delay compliance extension. This extension would apply when a fleet operator cannot complete infrastructure upgrades by the compliance date. The length of the extension for a facility side upgrade would be based on the circumstances of the delay and could be up to 2 years. Eligible reasons for facility side delay extensions include changes of general contractor, delays obtaining construction permits, delays due to unexpected safety issues, discovery of resources described in the California Environmental Quality Act, or natural disasters. In addition, an extension for delay due to utility side upgrades or lack of available power on the utility side of the meter may also be provided by CARB and could extend up to 5 years. The completion date for the upgrades must go beyond the compliance date for the fleet. The guiding principles that staff may use to evaluate an infrastructure extension include acknowledging that there could be circumstances beyond a fleet operator's control that results in the delay of necessary charging fueling infrastructure. Fleet operators must make all reasonable efforts to meet the timeframes proposed in the rule and must phase out as many LSI forklifts as possible prior to requesting an extension. Staff recognizes that some fleets may have multiple locations and will take this into account in the development of the applicable provisions. Staff aims to develop provisions that do not alter existing processes to plan for and build out electrical or fueling infrastructure. The zero-emission forklift team is working with advanced clean fleets to make the infrastructure delay requirements as similar as possible between the two regulations. Another concept staff is considering is a feasibility delay compliance extension. This potential provision would give fleet operators a compliance extension based on the lack of an available zero-emission forklift that meets the needs of a fleet operator's operation. One possible reason for requesting this extension could be lack of zero-emission forklift models that meet a necessary water intrusion rating. Fleet operators could be required to try out a zero-emission forklift in their operation before requesting an exemption. The extension would not be indefinite and would eventually sunset. This is only a concept at this time and details need to be worked out. So if you have feedback or input, please reach out to staff to discuss. We're going to pause here to take a couple of comments and questions on the concepts that have been discussed so far. However, in order to completely go through the presentation, we will delay questions on other topics that have not been discussed until the end of the presentation. Therefore, we will only take approximately 10 minutes for questions.
Thanks, Keith. So Margie, did we want to go with kind of the raised hands first?
We currently don't have any raised hands right now.
Okay, so maybe we'll just go to the written questions, Holmes.
Wait, we
Sure.
just received one.
Okay,
ahead,
well,
Marjorie.
Okay, 1 second. Oh, it's from Martin Boyd. Martin, you've been unmuted. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, state your name and affiliation, please, then ask your question.
Yes, my name is Martin Boyd. I am with the High Street Yale Group based here in Portland, Oregon. And David Chen, you and I have had a little bit of back and forth over the last 24 hours about slide number 15, about the definitions of capacity. And I just want to make sure that we have some direction on how to handle the definition of load capacity. I think there was some dialogue that's happened over the past 12 months about what that definition is, whether it's the capacity that relates to the max capacity of the truck, which is also a car aligns itself to the model designation of the forklift itself, versus a D-rated capacity. And I just think there's a little bit of confusion. I think the other OEMs within the Industrial Truck Association members, I think they'll also see that slide as well. And I think maybe perhaps we should have a discussion probably following the CARB workshop to discuss this in a little bit more detail. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
yeah, sure. Forgive me if I don't remember 100% correctly. I think when we were having those discussions, we had David Igus still on board here. He was like the staff lead at the time, and he left CARB, so he's no longer here with us. And so I think we lost some of the history of those discussions. But I think from just a technical standpoint, I think we do want to kind of stick with the B56.1 ANSI standard in terms of determining lift capacity. I think the question on our end is like, we know that that standard allows the determination of lift capacities at various load centers. It doesn't specify a specific load center. And so I think it does warrant additional discussion as to like kind of what was discussed before, and like what's the right way to kind of reference that standard and how to use it to determine lift capacity, and how to use it to kind of inform the applicability of this rule. But I just wanted to kind of communicate some of my thoughts on that. So everybody in the audience kind of knows where I'm coming from. Is that good for now? Oh. Yeah, so I mean, if you want to discuss further, feel free to give me, contact us after the workshop. And if anybody else wants to discuss, that offer applies to everybody. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Mary Alyssa Rancier. Mary, you've been unmuted. Please unmute yourself on your end, state your name and your affiliation.
Hi, this is Mary Alyssa Rance here with AGC of California. For considering, or the extensions that you're considering, I think it'll make the regulation a bit more feasible. I'd like to specifically talk about the feasibility delay compliance extension. So I know that one of our main concerns was that many of the zero-emission forklifts don't have sync the bills batteries, whereas
Mary, Mary, your connection, I don't know if it's your connection or our end, but I can't really get what your question. It's like breaking up a little bit. So maybe if you want to just type your question instead, and maybe we'll address it then. I heard you say something about the feasibility extension, and so I'll just speak a little bit about that. You know, we've been hearing that in certain categories of forklifts and certain operations, there might not be models that have the right specifications for those types of operations. You know, for example, I think we cited it in the slide, is that like the intrusion rating for water and dust. You know, if it's being used in a really wet environment, for example, there might not be forklifts available that can, in zero-emission forklifts available that can do that work, that can be in those environments. And you know, another thing we've heard is that, you know, some operations require to use they use their forklifts for towing. They do a lot of towing in their operations, and they're saying that they cannot find zero-emission models that they think that they can do that work. But in general, we are thinking about including some type of provisions for feasibility. But, you know, from our standpoint, it has to be based on things that are verifiable. So you know, it's not, so we don't just get a bunch of, you know, fleets telling us that they're not feasible without being able to kind of demonstrate or substantiate, I guess, those claims. And so IP rating is, I think, a good example, because those are that is a specification that we can kind of verify, right? That we can look at a forklift model, talk to the manufacturer, and figure out like what that IP rating for that forklift is, and we can kind of determine. We can look at the operation and says, well, okay, it makes sense that this IP rating can't do the work in this type of environment, and so that would be like something we can kind of incorporate, like we're considering to include in the rule. So in those cases, we could, like, depending on the circumstances, give an extension But as like we indicated in the slide, this extension does kind of go away. We're planning to sunset it at some point. So even if we did provide the provisions in the rule, they would go away at some point. And the expectation is that, you know, if there isn't a model there today, you know, there would be time, we'd be giving time for manufacturers and fleets to work together to develop models that can work in those type of environments. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Brian Harris. Brian, you've been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and your affiliation, and ask your question.
Hello, yes, this is Brian Harris, and I'm with Pape Material Handling based in California. And David, we've spoken a number of times. So my question is, in today's presentation, you mentioned the beginning date of the ruling starting January 1st of 2026 for Class 4. And I believe you now are saying Class 5. So starting on that date, you would no longer be able to purchase a new internal combustion powered unit under 12,000 pound capacity, but the sunset or the replacement dates have been changed to allow a customer a longer period of time to potentially eliminate units. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not 100% sure, Brian, what your question was exactly, but we are proposing a new kind of a phase out approach of existing forklifts. The restriction to purchase would still go into effect in 2026 for both Class 4s and 5s. At least that's the concept we have right now. But the actual phase out of existing 2025 model year and older forklifts would start. I guess that phase out would start depending on Class 4 or Class 5, and it'd be 2028 or 2029 respectively, I believe. Let me take a look at just to make sure.
The reason I ask is in the previous discussion, it was Class 4 was going to start on January 1st of 2026, but Class 5 was going to start January 1st of 2029. So for the elimination of purchasing new, they would both start now January 1st of 2026.
Yeah, so the reason why we're doing this is to provide kind of more flexibility up front. I mean, I think the expectation is still in 2026 and 2027 and so on and so forth, that fleets are doing what they need to phase out those forklifts. But, you know, we are trying. So, you know, the analogy is like, well, it's like steps going up into the second floor of a building, right? I mean, the original proposal was like there would be one step for every year, and so now we're like trying to reduce the number of steps, but we're still trying to reach that same elevation by a certain amount of time, right? So so I think, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Brian, but that is kind of the new proposal that we're presenting today for your feedback and comments.
Right. So again, the question is, can a person buy a new IC powered forklift in the state of California after January 1st of 2026? And if the answer is no, that's all I want to verify.
Okay. Yeah. The answer is no. Of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the rental agencies a little bit later. And I think we're kind of sticking with kind of our original concept on that, which would allow rental agencies to kind of purchase in 2026, 27, and 28, with the understanding that they would still kind of have to phase out all those at the end, at the last year of the phase out, together with their model year 2025s.
Great. Thank you very much.
Sure. You're welcome. Thanks, Brian.
Okay, we have another question from Priscilla Rodriguez. Priscilla, you've been unmuted. Please state your name and affiliation and ask your question.
Hi, good morning. This is Priscilla Rodriguez. I'm with Western Ag Processors and California Cotton Ginners and Growers Association. David, as you were going over the new proposed compliance phase out schedule, I noticed that there was no mention of a cap. I know the previous regulation provided a cap percentage for the phase out. Is that going to be considered for this one, or is that omitted from this stage?
Well, thank you for that question, Priscilla. So One of the things we tried to kind of resolve with this alternative approach was the caps, because and we can discuss this further, of course, but the idea is because we're going with these bigger steps, but there's more flexibility there, that maybe the caps wouldn't be needed. Because I mean, in the end, the caps also would add just a lot of administrative work, such as like the reporting. It probably require additional reporting. It require a lot of fleets to do additional tracking of which forklifts they're phasing out and stuff like that. Whereas we're hoping, like with this new approach, where it kind of gives you more time up front to figure out how you want to phase out your fleet, that we could avoid kind of instituting any type of cap provisions. But again, we are open for kind of discussing that further. If you think the caps still have a purpose, maybe we can talk about maybe how we can, I mean, if they're still necessary, and if they are, then how we could kind of incorporate them. But hopefully, again, that was something we were trying to kind of get rid of with this new approach.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Priscilla.
Okay, for written questions, we have several. We'll go over the first 5. Mark Feynman asked, on slide 12, you have regulation covering up to 12,000 pounds. Prior was up to and including 12,000 pounds. Is the new wording correct?
It is including 12,000 pounds. Sorry if that was not clear. If we can make that clear in the actual reg language in any future presentations. Thank you.
All right, the next question is from Alvin Chu. If a forklift is at a port facility and uses propane, is it under CHE or this regulation?
So if it's at a facility that's currently under the current cargo handling equipment regulation, then this rule would not apply to those. So they are going to be doing some type of zero emission regulation in the future, and so any forklifts at those facilities would be kind of bundled into that effort, into that measure.
Okay, thank you. The next question, I'm going to bundle the next 2 questions. One is from Mary Alyssa Rancier, and Daniel Langmaid asked an associated question, so I'm going to combine the 2. I would like to confirm that Class 7 forklifts will not be regulated by this regulation. And then Daniel asks, why are the rough terrain forklifts exempt?
I could take that one. Yes, in answer to Ms. Rancier's question, Class 7, which means rough terrain forklifts, are not included in this regulation. And the reason we exempted them is because they're largely diesel, and diesel forklifts and other off-road diesel equipment is already covered by CARB's in-use off-road diesel regulation. And so we didn't want to impose requirements that would be on top of other requirements. So fleets that have off-road diesel equipment are already phasing out older tiers under a mandated time schedule. So that explains our rationale. In addition, part of the driver for why we are pursuing this regulation is because zero emission forklifts are kind of ready for prime time in warehouse uses and many other applications, and we don't think they're as far along in terms of handling the applications that rough terrain forklifts are used in. So that's another reason that we were comfortable excluding them from this regulatory effort.
Thank you. And Man Altaher asks, on slide 11, can you please repeat the e-forklifts penetration percentage?
So I think the percentage you're talking about is the sales percentage, really, from the Industrial Truck Association publication, and that percentage was 40%, 46% of forklifts that I think that were sold or were electric in 2018.
All right, and the final written question for this segment is from Bob Rost, And it's a repeat question that occurs from multiple attendees, and that is, will the slide deck be made available?
And I can take that one. And yes, it is already available on the website for CARB zero emission forklift regulation. So we sent that out with a government gov delivery note. But if you don't have that handy, if you just Google CARB zero emission forklift meetings, you'll find the website, and the slides for this presentation and our inventory staff's presentation are already posted there.
So are we ready to move on to the next section?
Why don't I take
Sure.
why
Oh,
don't
go
I
ahead.
take one more? So Mark Feynman at 921 asked, slide 20 has the starting phase out in 2026, and slide 18 has it starting in 2028, which is correct. If you can bring up slide 20, I think the commenter misunderstood the slide. What we were trying to contrast on slide 20 was our previous proposal had a mandatory phase out in 26, and we're trying to provide some flexibility. And so we've moved that to 2028. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll start the presentation again. After discussing possible extensions, we will now discuss the possible exemption concepts. As CARB staff proposed earlier, there may be a low-use exemption for fleet operators that use some other forklifts for less than 200 hours per year. The fleet operators could have up to 10% of their total fleet, including electric forklifts, designated as low use. The exemption would sunset by 2031 for all businesses except micro businesses, who would be able to maintain one low-use forklift indefinitely. This exemption would require annual reporting. To provide more flexibility, CARB staff is considering a 3-year rolling 600-hour average instead of a 1-year 200-hour average compliance timeframe. Staff is considering providing an exemption for emergency operations. However, we have not received stakeholder feedback on the need for such an exemption. The role of an affected forklift in an emergency operation and possible requirements of the proposed exemption. Therefore, staff is requesting your input on the need for this exemption and what should be considered an emergency operation. Draft regulatory, excuse me. Gonna have to pause here for a sec. My battery's running low on my computer here, so let me plug it in. Hold on.
Maybe while Keith's doing that, I can take another question from the Q&A. Mary Rancier asks, when will the regulatory language be released? At a minimum, we will release the regulatory language along with the staff report that comes out 45 days ahead of the hearing. However, we we'll try to get a draft out for stakeholders to review ahead of that, but we don't have a specific date yet.
Okay, I'm back. Staff is looking into adding an exemption for fleet operators who own facilities that are in remote locations or typically operate in remote locations. Staff would like to get specific information from stakeholders on operations where the forklifts are not returned to the same location on a regular basis. Further, the regulation will need to be defined, will need to define remote location, and staff is looking into getting input from stakeholders on how the exemption provisions should be structured. Next. Forklift rental agencies, dealers, and manufacturers may have slightly different requirements than fleet operators. Rental agencies would be required to follow the same model year phase-out schedule as large fleet operators. A rental agency would be allowed to purchase new Class 5 forklifts until 2029, but those would also have to be phased out in 2038, along with 2025 model year Class 5 affected forklifts, as described on the previous slide about phase-out schedules. As presented at the last working group meeting, forklift dealers would not be permitted to sell Class 4 forklifts to fleet operators or rental agencies after 2026. Class 5 forklifts could only be sold to rental agencies until 2029. Forklift dealers would have to provide CARB with an annual report that includes forklift sales. The proposed regulation requirements for manufacturers have not changed since the July release of the draft regulation, which required all manufacturers of forklifts sold in California after 2026 to certify forklifts to a zero-emission standard and provide CARB with annual production and sales reporting. Some other changes to the proposed regulation that CARB staff is considering are eliminating the allowance for a fleet operator to purchase new forklifts for low use. Based on stakeholder feedback, staff does not expect such purchases to occur. Further, the last draft regulation stated that fleet operators must no longer possess an affected forklift within 5 business days of the delivery of the zero-emission forklift. Based on stakeholder comments, staff is considering provisions that would allow the fleet operator to keep the affected forklift at the site for a certain period of time, providing the forklift cannot be operated. Staff is also considering ways to reduce reporting requirements while still meeting the goals of the proposed regulation. The next slide will present the expected emission benefits of the regulation that were proposed in the last discussion draft. This slide shows the projected NOx emission reductions over the proposed phase-out timeframe. Please note that these are only preliminary estimates and could change. The proposed regulation is estimated to reduce NOx emissions by 8.7 tons per day, PM 2.5 by 0.64 tons per day, and ROG emissions by 1.24 tons per day by 2038. In addition, the proposed regulation is estimated to reduce CO2 emissions by 13.2 million metric tons by 2043. Next, staff is going to go over some preliminary cost estimates of the proposed regulation. As with the emission estimates, the cost numbers here are also preliminary and could change. A preliminary estimate of the statewide costs are summarized in this table. Total direct costs are 9.3 billion. Total direct savings are 13.8 billion. This results in a projected net savings of 4.5 billion. Keep in mind that this is an overall statewide estimation. Costs and savings will vary for individual fleets. Effectively, the savings over time from reduced maintenance and fuel costs for ZE forklifts is estimated to outweigh the upfront costs for a zero-emission forklift and infrastructure on a statewide basis. This cost estimate will most likely change once the regulation concept is finalized. Here is a preliminary estimate of the avoided mortality and morbidity incidents statewide from the emission reductions estimated from implementation of the proposed regulation. Cardiopulmonary mortality, 845. Hospitalizations for cardiovascular illness, 136. Hospitalizations for respiratory illness, 163. emergency room visits, 422. These estimates are also preliminary and will most likely change as the regulation concept evolves. Here's a return on investment fleet example for the replacement of LSI forklifts with an electric forklift, forklift, it's a single forklift, electric forklift that has a lithium-ion battery. This estimate shows that based on the inputs presented, there is an estimated annual savings of $7,300, which is due to lower operational costs of the lithium battery forklift than the propane forklift. Although the lithium ion forklift has higher upfront costs than the propane forklift, over time, the annual savings of $7,300 offsets the higher upfront costs. This estimate also includes monetary benefits from CARB's low carbon fuel standard program. The break-even point is estimated to occur in about 6 years. Staff's assumptions for the average annual hours of operation and the lift capacity of the forklift are based on data from CARB's large spark ignition equipment emission inventory. Staff's assumption for electrical rate was a weighted average derived using the CARB's truck and bus charging calculator. Also note that this estimate is for a new purchase and does not include the residual value of the LSI forklift being replaced. Including the residual value would significantly reduce the return on investment timeline. This is similar to the last slide, but this slide is intended to represent a small business. The assumed annual hours of operation are about 1,000 instead of close to 2,000. This assumption was based on data in CARB's inventory model. Instead of assuming replacement with a lithium-ion battery forklift, staff assumed replacement with a less expensive option, a lead-acid battery lift, due to the reduced operating hours assumption of 1,000 hours per year. Under this scenario, the break-even point is about 7 years. If the annual operating hours are higher, the break-even point would occur sooner. Like the previous example, residual value of the LSI forklift being replaced was not considered. Next, I will cover the environmental analysis for this proposed regulation. CARB is preparing a programmatic, I'll get it right, level environmental analysis, or EA, assessing the potential for adverse and beneficial environmental impacts associated with the proposed zero-emission forklift regulation. The EA is prepared according to the requirements of our certified regulatory program under the California Environmental Quality Act. The EA will be based on anticipated reasonably foreseeable actions undertaken by entities in response to the proposed regulation, which could have the potential to cause indirect physical changes to the environment. CARB is using the CEQA environmental checklist as framework for assessing the potential significant impacts resulting from reasonably foreseeable actions. The checklist includes criteria related to resource areas such as aesthetics, agricultural and forest resources, biological resources, cultural resources, geologic and soil resources, hazards and hazardous materials, among others. The EA will be included as an appendix to the staff report. The EA will include a description of the reasonably foreseeable actions that appear most likely to occur as a result of implementing the proposed regulation, the potential adverse impacts and feasibility mitigation measures, and alternative analysis. Staff welcomes public input on the appropriate scope and content of the EA as it is being developed, including the reasonably foreseeable actions that may occur in response to the proposal, the potential significant adverse impacts, potential feasible mitigation measures, and feasible alternatives to the proposal that could reduce or eliminate any significant adverse impacts. The draft EA will be released for 45-day public comment period with the staff report later in 2023. Staff would like to get comments on the proposed concepts. This slide and the next slide lists some of the concepts we would like to get more information from stakeholders. Staff is seeking feedback on all regulatory concepts discussed today, but the following slides include some specific questions about concepts that have not yet been fleshed out yet, such as the potential exemptions for emergency operations and remote work sites. For emergency operations, are there LSI forklift fleets dedicated to emergency operations? How are LSI forklifts used in emergency operations? For remote work sites, what are LSI forklifts used for at remote work sites? Suggestions on how to define remote work sites. For the infrastructure delay extension provision, what documentation could fleets provide CARB to substantiate infrastructure efforts and status? How far in advance of a compliance date should a fleet be required to contact their utility, electric utility? For the feasibility delay extension provision, what documentation could fleets provide CARB to substantiate that zero-emission forklifts are not feasible at their facility? And again, just to reiterate, we would appreciate any other feedback you have on the regulatory concept. Next slide, please. Regarding the next steps, staff is hoping to continue to work with stakeholders to get input on the proposed concepts, then further refine the draft regulation. The standardized regulatory impact analysis will be sent to the Department of Finance in April of 2023. Depending on the stakeholder input and concept changes, staff may hold additional public meetings. The proposed regulation is scheduled to go to the board in the fall of 2023. Here is our contact information for myself and next slide, please. Presented here are the zero-emission forklift web page link, the subscriber link, list link for getting email updates on the zero-emission forklift regulation, and a link to CARB's other off-road equipment regulations. We will now take comments and questions on the regulation. Also, we will be ending the questions and comments at 11:20 to allow our inventory group time to present. Any questions that we did not answer, we expect to have some time after inventory's presentation to answer some of the questions that were here, comments. And if we do not get to all the questions, please send your questions, comments to the ZE Forklifts email address or contact staff. As a reminder, this workshop is being recorded and will be posted to the Zero-Emission Forklift website. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a raised hand from Bob Shepherd. Bob, you've been unmuted. Please state your name and affiliation and ask your question.
Yeah, Bob Shepherd with Quinn. Kind of wanted to go back to the earlier part there. Priscilla mentioned cost caps. We still believe that even with the difference in the schedule, that will become necessary for large fleets. So we still want that left on the table to discuss maybe in separate meetings. The remote location deal, we've asked over and over for something that actually defines not the rough terrain forklift, but actual rough terrain. You got snow, you got sleet, you got mud, you got asphalt, rough asphalt and gravel. Those kind of things can make it infeasible for electric lifts if those are the parameters that the operators have. The other thing that in the feasibility, we need to make sure that gradability is considered. Again, the electric forklifts have a limitation, roughly about 10% grade, and that gets worse if it's raining in slick, whereas the propane forklifts do have the torque ability to be able to manage much more incline, 30 or 40%. So those we do want to have in there as the feasibility checkpoints. I want to make sure on the infrastructure extensions that includes if there's requirements, and there will be requirements for awnings or additional indoor space, then that would require building permits, etc. And there can be huge delays in that. So not only just electrical infrastructure we're talking about the under roof storage. I did see in the slide a very, very low number, I thought, for install of electrical. There's, it was like 3,000 or 4,000, I think you had on one of your slides. That seems a little bit low, especially if you're going to put in multiple of these units. The last thing I would have a comment on or question on would be, you said, yes, rental can continue to purchase new for their fleets up to 2029. For the phase out of those, are we looking at January 1, 2028? It wasn't mentioned in the slides, but I was just curious if that's what you're dealing with. And the last thing that I would mention is, again, we got to be careful with over policing. The whole thing about dealer annual reporting. You think about a forklift dealer as being somebody like Quinn or like Toyota or like a Heister. You got a whole bunch of people that deal with forklifts. You're talking about auctions, you're talking about used equipment dealers, independent dealers, and you're not going to have a level playing field. And this is why we continue to ask for the dealer reporting requirements to be removed. Simply do like the other regulations. You have the disclosure statement about sales, and you can do what you did in the portable equipment regulation and put in a prohibition clause. But to have this reporting, you're going to end up having the people that are doing the right thing and end up being the people reporting, and you're going to have everybody else out there that's not going to be doing the reporting. You're not going to be catching it. So over policing is discouraged. Anyway, those are my comments.
Hey, thanks, Bob. Really appreciate how seriously you take this and how thoroughly you comment, and your comments are always really helpful. I'll take part of your question. You were asking that we take into account rough terrain, gradability, issues like that. And that is part of what we're thinking about when we talk about the feasibility delay compliance extension that's described on slide 30. Those are just the types of issues that we're hoping that would be applicable for. So thanks for pointing that out. You also asked about delays other than, specifically like a utility delay, if people are putting in charging infrastructure. And yeah, our intent in the facility side infrastructure delays that we discuss on slide 28 is to include things like that. We listed some things that could occur, like a general contractor change or delays in permits, but that isn't intended to be a complete list of everything that could happen. Okay, so I don't know if David Chen wants to take some other parts of your question.
Sure. So on terms of the volume caps are still necessary for large fleets, I think that probably warrants like a separate discussion. So we can kind of understand more deeply kind of what the concerns are. And kind of look at, and then kind of look at, match that up with kind of our new approach and see how I guess the volumes are going to differ between the two scenarios. You say something about how our cost of infrastructure assumption is low. That was pulled from, and I can't remember the exact report, but I believe it might have been a CEC study or something about like the installation of, I think it was like level 2 chargers nationwide. And that was kind of the number that was the number we pulled from that report. And that's for one charger. So if you're installing more than one forklift, you're going to be paying that, or we're assuming it would cost that for each charger that you put in. And, in terms of infrastructure, as we all know, it's going to vary depending on what the specific situation is at a location, right? So again, that is like an average number. So, I mean, in terms of, it could be higher, it could be lower. It just really depends on a lot of different factors there. In terms of the rentals, you said, yes, they can continue to purchase, but at least at this point, the concept would not extend the phase out. So although the rental agencies would be able to continue purchasing Class 5 forklifts in 2026, 27, and 2028, they would all have to be phased out together in 2038 with their 2025 model year forklifts. In terms of the dealer reporting, there's going to be some level of reporting that's necessary for certain elements of our rule, but we are continuing to look at kind of the reporting elements to see where we can kind of streamline and reduce and maybe in some cases eliminate. We didn't have enough time kind of before this meeting to kind of really to vet that out, but we will continue to look at ways to reduce the reporting, I would say. So that is something that's on our list of things. I think I addressed all your questions, but if not, I guess you can raise your hand again. Thank you, Bob.
Okay, we have a follow-up question from Mary Alyssa Rancier. I have unmuted you. Please state your name and affiliation and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Mary Alyssa Rancier at AGC of California. I believe I was kind of cut off from my first question due to technical difficulty. So I'll go back to that first. It was in regards to the feasibility. So one of our main concerns was like the capabilities of zero-emission forklifts, such as like what Bob mentioned, the gradability concerns that zero emissions can only reach about 10% incline, whereas their counterparts can reach about 30-40% incline. So if a forklift is not able to meet those gradability concerns, would they qualify under this extension? And I believe you kind of addressed it with last question. It sounds like yes. And then my second question or comment is in regards to the remote location exemption. So as Bob mentioned, that there are some additional infrastructure that's needed to build. There is additional infrastructure that needs to be built. Electric forklifts do need to be covered under roof covered space. And there's concerns with the lack of DC charging capabilities on these remote locations. Almost all construction sites would be considered remote locations. And I just want to make sure that that would be included in the definition. This varies from like highways to, heavy civil situations near bridges, and the possibilities are endless with that. And those are my comments.
Okay. Mary, your connection was still kind of spotty, but I think I understand what your questions are. So the first one was you were asking about the feasibility extension. So at this point, that's just an idea. We don't actually have any like formal provisions kind of laid out. I mean, this is an idea that we want to discuss with stakeholders, and we're really looking for your feedback. In terms of the gradability, that is something we've heard is an issue. And so what we're trying to figure out is like, we know that forklifts are rated or less rated for gradability, or there's like some specification for each forklift in terms of what kind of grade it can handle. But we've also heard from some dealers and that that's not actually a good metric to go by, because it's like, just because it's rated for a certain grade doesn't mean it could do, 5 hours of that work. And so I think we need kind of more discussion with folks on like, how to kind of lay out the conditions and the provisions of such an extension. And so that's kind of the reason why we're talking about it, this presentation, is to kind of put the idea out there, and hopefully, maybe that spurs some future discussions with you all, the stakeholders, and to kind of help us kind of craft that language there. But again, we're really trying to avoid kind of a free for all where someone can just say, well, this is not feasible, and so and then just give just write some type of explanation without any like formal substantiation. We're really trying to avoid that. So it's like we're really trying to tie kind of the way something operates to a specification of the forklift. And so just kind of keep that in mind. In terms of remote location exemptions, thank you for those comments. In terms of like the roof covered space requirement, and we'll talk more with manufacturers about this, but my understanding is that there are forklift models available that can kind of be parked outside. But again, we'll continue to work with manufacturers to confirm that. And we'll note your other additional comment about like construction sites being remote locations, as we kind of refine the language there. And that, again, that also is an idea that we've pitched multiple times at multiple meetings, but we just really haven't received, I guess, enough information for us to actually put pen to paper yet. So hopefully, like, you guys, the stakeholders can continue to reach out to us if you have these concerns, so that we can kind of work through and kind of work through the questions that we have, and help us kind of create these provisions in a way that make sense. Thanks.
We have another question from Mark Andres. Mark, you've been unmuted. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Mark Andres, Toyota Material Handling, Northern California. My question really is, I understand the regulation. I understand everything you guys have been really talking about, but as we look to educate our customers, I'm really curious on more, if you guys can talk a little bit more about accountability around this reporting, I guess. I know it's doors, different things like that, just so we can look to talk a little more intelligently about, because everybody listening to this, who's hearing this, that we're talking to, it's kind of like, I think obviously there's going to be quite a bit of resistance. And, people are kind of, just candidly speaking, are probably saying, well, how are they going to police this? How are they going to, look to hold us accountable for this? Can you talk a little more about that?
Sure. So just again, I just want to emphasize that we are kind of looking at the reporting concept that we have right now and looking at ways to streamline and reduce it. Because like what's in there now, kind of in that previous draft that was released, would require like at least an initial snapshot of your entire fleet, and then there would be kind of annual updates that would need to be reported. One of the things we were trying to accomplish with this new phase out, and the allowance to buy a used LSI forklifts, which in the previous concept we didn't allow that. That it looks like there's an opportunity that we could reduce reporting, but in the end, it's like there are certain things. Example could be like a low use forklift. Like there really isn't a way to enforce that rule without any reporting, that element without any reporting, right? If we don't know what the hours are on a forklift, they're not reported, then we don't know if a fleet is staying under 200 hours a year or staying under 600 hours every 3 years or whatever, right? I mean, so there's going to be information that's required to be submitted for certain elements of the rule, but we are trying to look at ways to kind of minimize that as much as possible. So I don't know if Mark, if that kind of answers your question, but
Yeah.
Maybe I can add a little bit. I think Mark may have also been asking just generally about how do we enforce this, and that is a big concern we have. And one of the reasons we've really been striving to structure this rule in a way that it's simple to enforce. In other words, in a way that where if an inspector goes out to a facility, they can look around and relatively quickly, easily tell if a fleet is in compliance, is because we are very cognizant of the need to provide a level playing field and be able to use our enforcement resources wisely. Like, we don't have an infinite number of inspectors out there. So that's one of the reasons we did get a number of comments early in the rulemaking process asking us, why can't you do like a fleet average approach like CARB has done on some previous rulemakings? And the reason we really have tried to avoid that is to ease enforceability and make it so this can be enforced with the finite enforcement resources that we do have.
So Kim, so based on that, then, so like David had said, a lot of this enforcement will be based on the initial snapshot of the fleet, I suppose. So if an inspector were to come out, they would basically say, A, we don't have your initial snapshot, or here's your initial snapshot, and how does that compare, right? And I know you don't have infinite inspectors and whatnot, but you have to act as if, right? And that's the general way you guys are going to kind of do this, have an initial snapshot. This will be used to put up indoors. Is that right, David?
Yes, if we do have any reporting, whatever reporting requirements we'll be proposing would be collected through doors.
Okay.
We do have, go ahead, Kim, did you want to?
Oh, I was just going to clarify that we're trying to set this up in a way such that an inspector doesn't really need to refer to the initial snapshot in every case. Like, we're trying to make it clear that, as of this calendar year, anything older than this model year needs to be gone. So if they see a spark ignition forklift that's older than this model year operating, they know, oh, that's out of compliance. So we're trying to avoid the situation where someone really needs to understand the totality of the whole fleet and see all the equipment at once in order to understand if a fleet's in compliance or out.
Yeah, so I was saying we previously released the draft language we previously released has requirements to for a fleet to report like a snapshot. We're not sure, kind of with our new phase out approach, whether and the the allowance for fleets to buy used LSI forklifts. We're not sure if the snapshot would still be required, but that's something we're going to continue to look at after this workshop. And our plan is to kind of release another version of our draft language sometime in the next couple months with kind of our current thinking. But we are trying to reduce the reporting burden on fleets and as well as dealers and rental agencies.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like, just in listening to Kim and you, David, it's really going to be based upon the matrix. Basically, if someone were to come in and if an inspector were to come in, they're going to be basically looking at the matrix based on the date. And if we have anything in operation that doesn't fit the potential of the particular matrix, then obviously we're out of compliance. And
right.
Things will happen. I get it now.
Right. Thank you, Mark.
All right, should we go to some of the written questions?
Great. Let's start with Brandon Craighead. Since you are requiring zero emission, a lot of companies in the state will go electric. With that in mind, what is CARB doing to increase the infrastructure in the Central Valley to ensure there is great enough supply for all companies to charge their forklifts? With rolling blackouts a frequent event in the summer months, this is a great concern for myself and my company. Last summer, the governor asked people not to charge their vehicles. Will that happen to companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've received this question from a number of folks, and your observation is definitely correct. So this issue of capacity for charging is one that CARB is working on closely with our state partner agencies, including CEC, CPUC, and the affected electric utilities, to try to increase the power needed, not just for forklifts, obviously, but the state is really, in order to combat climate change, the state is embarking on a really ambitious transformation of how we charge or how we power everything, right? Including light duty cars and trucks. So forklifts are a relatively small piece of the overall pie, but recognizing that if you own forklifts, you want to be sure that and we're pushing you to transition to battery powered forklifts, then you really want to be sure the power's there when you need it. So yeah, we definitely are working on that, and with a particular focus in the Central Valley, where we've heard there are a lot of infrastructure concerns, particularly for more remote facilities. Okay, so that's that one. Thank you.
Great, thank you. John Pizarro asks, what would be the reasoning to exempt diesel-powered forklifts?
So as I mentioned earlier, the reason we carved them out from here is because we're trying to avoid duplicative requirements and fleets being subject to multiple conflicting requirements at the same time, and diesel forklifts are already covered along with other off-road diesel equipment in our in-use off-road diesel regulation. But we are just keep in mind, one thing that we are keeping in mind as we try to structure these requirements for phasing out spark ignition forklifts is we really want to set this up in a way that doesn't backfire and cause people to say, all right, well, forget it. I'm just going to change out my spark ignition forklifts for diesel forklifts, because that would really not achieve any of the goals of this rulemaking. And so if you guys are listening to us and you're thinking, well, darn it, I'm just going to go diesel, then please talk to us, because we're trying to build in provisions for situations that might push people into that situation, like the gradability or the towing or things like that. So if there's something we've missed that you think would push you or other fleets into just saying, I'm just going to get rid of my spark ignition forklifts and go diesel, please talk to us, because that is definitely not the result that we're looking for from this effort.
And if I can just add to what Kim mentioned there, please talk to us to help us find a solution that would work for you, not because we want to try to block you from going diesel. We just want to help you find a solution. The next question is from Brian Gonzalez. Just a few years ago, we had to replace our forklifts with CARB approved equipment. It's unconscionable that we will need to do this again. Since California is mandating replacing functional equipment before the end of its typical useful life, and also mandating infrastructure improvements, is California going to pay for their mandated requirements? It costs California nothing to disseminate regulations. Why should businesses be forced to fund California's initiative, creating a business unfriendly environment?
So I can take that one, and thank you very much for your comment. And I totally hear the frustration that's underlying your comment, and we get that California is heavily regulated. CARB is probably the most active air quality agency in the nation. However, like, the reason behind all these regulations are twofold. One is protecting public health, saving a bunch of lives and making the air cleaner, and then also addressing the current climate emergency. Like, the only way we're going to be able to address this current climate emergency is by transitioning how we power everything. And that's not going to be convenient or easy, but it's kind of necessary for protecting civilization as we know it. So we totally get that we're imposing inconvenience on folks. As far as whether is California going to pay for this, there are laws. There is a law recently passed that does require the public utilities to pay for providing the needed infrastructure. So that is part of what's happening. However, we are cognizant that this requirement to phase out spark ignition forklifts is going to impose cost on fleets. We think in most cases, many or most cases, eventually businesses will make back that money through fuel savings. but we're not saying that's true in every case. There may be cases where people don't have high enough use on their forklifts to offset that additional purchase cost. And part of what we do when we do these rulemakings is we're very aware that we're imposing cost on business, and it's a trade-off, right? So we're trying to strike the right balance between protecting public health and addressing climate change and impacting people's lives and jobs and businesses. So really appreciate your comment, and that's my answer, Holmes.
Thank you,
So
Kim.
I just wanted to add that there may be incentive programs that fleets could qualify for depending on their situation. I mean, like the CARB program, the Clean Air Protection, Community Air Protection Program. I mean, a lot of these programs are kind of administered by local air districts. And so, if fleets are thinking about turning over equipment now, they should probably consult their local air district and talk to them. We do have programs here at the state level as well, like the Clean Off-Road Equipment Voucher Incentive Project. Not sure how much funding is available in this go round, but when it reopens at some point in the future, there'll be money there potentially for forklifts. Also, I just wanted to say, so we're trying to structure our rule in a way where fleets can access like car Moyer incentives. Like there are kind of like requirements in there in terms of like, well, we can't pay for compliance and stuff like that. So we are trying to kind of structure the rules so that fleets, at least early on, will still have, even for their older forklifts, potentially like access to those dollars if they're willing to do them kind of 3 years ahead. I think that's the project, the requirement in Moyer, 3 years ahead of kind of when it actually will be required by the rule. And so by having that first larger step, right, delaying that kind of start date a few years, that's going to make it easier for fleets to access the CARB Moyer funding. But again, those, like I said, those are administered by the local air districts, and they do have discretion on what they will fund. And so my best suggestion is to reach out to your local air district if you're interested.
And let me add another thing there. Thank you for describing the incentives, David. One other program that's really beneficial to know about if you own forklifts is the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, LCFS program, which does provide significant credits today for zero-emission forklifts. So that's definitely something to look into if you currently operate zero-emission forklifts or you think you're going to need to under the mandates of this rule. You may be able to get significant credits that largely offset the cost of the forklifts via our LCFS program.
Okay, we have several more questions. How are we doing on time?
Well, I think we're going until 11:20 before we hand it off to inventory. So we'll just keep going through questions until then. I'm not sure if it's time to alternate to a verbal question, but.
Yeah, we'll do one more of the written questions, and then we'll switch over to raised hands.
Okay.
Mark Feynman asks, on slide 30, what is the idea for a sunset date?
Can you guys pull up slide 30 so people know what he's asking about? And I can answer. So this concerns the sunset date for one of our exemptions in case of in case there's no zero emission equipment that's feasible. And we're looking for feedback on what folks think the sunset date should be. Sort of the latest sunset date that we would consider is likely 2035, because under the governor's executive order 7920, we're we've been directed to try to phase out combustion powered equipment in favor of zero emission equipment by 2035. So 2035 is probably the latest, but if folks have other ideas on what the sunset date should be, we really welcome that feedback.
Okay.
Thank you, Kim. And we will transition back to raised hands at this time.
Okay, we have a follow-up question from Bob Shepard. Bob, I have unmuted your mic. Please unmute your mic and state your name and affiliation.
Hey, Bob Shepard again from Quinn. I'm looking at slide 36. And it was the intent of our comments before we're not just talking about class 5 being allowed to purchase new. We'd be looking at both 4 and 5. Keep in mind, you know, when somebody has one of their own propane forklifts that's still part of their fleet, still legal part of their fleet that hasn't been phased out, and it goes down. They need something that they can rent in a pinch to be able to use during the time that forklift is in repair. So I don't know why you're just saying that class 5 could be purchased up to 2029. Again, the example is if you go to rent a car, you want to have something that is of the latest model or a lot newer, lower hour, so that there's not issues with that forklift going down while you have your other forklift under repair. So we asked that the class 4 and class 5 be available to purchase as new into rental fleets up until 2029. The other thing I was just curious about, why you're still stuck on phasing out low use by 2031. Again, this stuff is being used minusculely, and we're talking about something that is, you know, probably those forklifts are still like the 0.3 gram, 0.2 actual gram certification, or under the certified emissions. And so the emissions are going to be really low, even at 200 hours a year. So give it some thought on that. I'd really like to see that be pushed out to 2038, given the minuscule emissions.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bob. So on the purchase of the allowance to continue to purchase new class 5 effective forklifts, I'm just not sure if it's really needed for the class 4. I mean, we can continue to discuss, but you know, there are solutions there. It seems, I mean, from what we understand, and for those indoor facilities to take class 4, potentially for outdoor facilities too. I don't know. I mean, we can, like I said, continue to discuss, but I'm just not sure there's a need for the class 4s. They're much more mature. The zero emission spaces technology is much more mature for class 4s. You know, what's out there today, the zero emission forklifts are probably mostly class 4s, and class 5s, you know, but you know, they're emerging, you know, they're a little bit behind. They're behind the class 4s for sure, but just not 100% sure they're needed for the class 4s. But I mean, we can talk about it after the workshop further if you'd like. In terms of phasing out the low use, you know, our feeling is that I think we want all this stuff to go zero eventually. You know, whether 2031 is the right date or not, I mean, maybe we can continue to talk about that, but the ultimate goal is for everything to kind of go zero. So regardless, we do want to sunset that. I mean, zero emission technology can work in those applications as well. And as more and more zero emission forklifts get deployed, you know, they'll likely trickle down to the fleets that need low use forklifts, and they'll have more zero emission options at that time as well. So thanks, Bob. I don't know if you have any follow-up, but thank you. Hello?
We'll move on to the next question. It's from John McClellan. I have unmuted your mic. Please state your affiliation and ask your question.
Do you hear me?
Yes, John.
Oh, okay. Thank you. John McClellan, American Rental Association. I have two things. One, I think I saw maybe on the slide before the one that's up right now, are all rental fleets that are of forklifts that are for rent, are they all going to be classified as large fleets? Or are we going to still have small fleet? Are rental companies going to still be able to qualify as small fleets if they meet the, you know, number of units for a small fleet?
So I don't think we reflected any of that in the actual presentation, but I think we agreed to that in concept. that we would at least look into that, allowing smaller rental fleets to qualify as small fleets. So.
Okay, very, very good. We can continue to talk about that. The other thing that wasn't addressed, and I just wanted to bring this up again, we've discussed this several times, but it does sort of relate back to this issue of some of these exemptions, and it's based on the idea that we have talked about with charging standards. So across manufacturers, we are under the impression that different manufacturers are going to have different charging systems, different connectivity, all kinds of things like that. If that continues to be the case, and there's no sort of universal charging mechanisms that are going to be made available, then rental companies are likely going to go to just having one manufacturer. And I would point out that when you have one manufacturer that you're using to supply everything, and there's a problem in their supply chain for whatever reason it might be, all of a sudden you're going to have more of these requests for an exemption based on supply chain or some other technological issue or something like that. So, we still have concerns about that and the ability for our members to be able to buy forklifts that can be recharged sort of anywhere, anytime with the same mechanism.
So thank you, John, for that comment. I'm all for universal charging standards, but I'm just not sure kind of what our role as a state agency is in that. I mean, I think like on the light duty side, that kind of happened organically as the pressure to make EVs kind of was applied. I don't know if you have any suggestions on how we can play maybe a more active role in that. I mean, I think we would definitely look into that and consider it. I think that would resolve kind of a lot of like challenges that exist today in the forklift space, and especially for rental in the rental market, right? So yeah, I mean,
I don't have a specific solution, David.
Yeah.
I'm just hoping the manufacturers that are maybe listening on the call take note of this.
Thank you, John.
And, understand what it's going to be like, on our end, because rental is different. If you're a fixed location, if you're a warehouse, you may decide to just have a standardized, process all the way through and through. And with rental, it's a lot different because you got not only what you're doing in the rental yard, but also what's happening on location, and that's going to be a problem. And we're concerned about it. And we continue to be concerned about that. So anyway, appreciate it.
No, thank you, John. Thank you for the comment.
Okay, our next question is from Daniel Curtin. Daniel, you've been unmuted. Please state your name and affiliation and ask your question or comment.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Danny Curtin, California Conference of Carpenters. Calling, of course, on behalf of the construction workers, but also our employers. First of all, I want to thank you all for an incredible, not just presentation, but outreach, and the complexity of this it magnifies every time you say something, it raises 20 more questions. But thank you for the ROI slides and extended timelines. But I have and I'm not an expert here, the question of rough terrain versus rough terrain vehicles and, classification 5, that's what I understand is used a lot on construction sites. My assumption, and tell me if I'm wrong, or maybe you can define it a little better, is a construction site defined as a rough terrain, because obviously there's no pavement, and it could be, as somebody earlier mentioned, rain and all that kind of external effort problems. That's an important question. Does class 5 by definition capable of rough terrain, or is there a definition of a rough terrain vehicle? Because the slides were slightly different. They use different categories, number one. There's also a concern about multi-level construction on fresh concrete and the weight necessary for these battery driven. And I'm not sure all the details on that, but there is a potential danger on fresh concrete on a multi-story building having extra weight added. And the other thing is on new construction sites, there's often no power, and getting the power set up through the utilities is getting more and more complicated because of they're behind on even completed construction projects. The movement of materials on a construction site is mission critical for really an economically an efficient construction project, but it also is mission critical for the safety of the workers on that job. Never mind, the danger of the vehicle itself and potential problems there. Just the movement of heavy materials is a very complicated problem. So I'm raising a couple of questions. I have a sense that you've looked into this and will continue to look into it, but the one that just pops out is rough terrain. I mean, you can't go on a construction site without it being rough terrain. What does that mean? Are those vehicles exempted no matter what classification they're in?
Yeah, so a class 5 forklift is like a typical outdoor pneumatic tired forklift. It's not, so a rough terrain, it refers to a specific classification in OSHA's industrial truck classification system. And so it has to meet the ANSI standard, I think B56.6, which requires there's specific test parameters that a forklift would have to kind of go through and have to be proved essentially through that standard in order to be called a rough terrain forklift. And so when we say rough terrain, we're not talking about the terrain itself. We're referring to a classification of forklifts, and in that it's actually a class 7 forklift as part of the OSHA classification system.
Okay.
So that's that. We did receive that comment earlier that we should be looking more at the terrain itself rather than the forklift, and that's something we can continue to talk about. We'll discuss internally. We can talk with the stakeholders that would like us to do that. In terms of the extra weight, I think with the advances in battery technology, there's a lot of forklifts today are being they're being designed and built with lithium ion batteries, where they are not as heavy as the lead acid batteries for the same amount of energy. And so maybe some of those concerns would be resolved by going with a lithium ion solution, or maybe even a fuel cell solution if that's where you want to go, rather than lead acid. Not 100% sure. This is kind of the first time we've heard that specific concern directly. So I mean, maybe it warrants a follow-up discussion or something so we can understand kind of what's going on there. And then the no power at construction sites, yeah, that's an issue that we're trying to kind of resolve here, trying to reconcile. I mean, we don't want fleets to use diesel forklifts instead of to replace their LSIs with diesel. We don't want fleets to use a diesel generator to charge their zero-emission forklifts. And so, yeah, I mean, this is something we're trying to tackle here. One of the puzzles we're trying to solve. So, I mean, if you have additional feedback or something on that, please contact us after the workshop so we can discuss more about it.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll stay with
you.
We have one more verbal question. Krista Weiner. Krista, you've been unmuted. Please unmute yourself, state your name and affiliation, and make your question or comment.
Krista Warner with Western Propane Gas Association. I'd like to know how the 18 cents per kilowatt hour charging standard was calculated and what the savings breakdown for fuel versus maintenance, since those are both considered significant savings in the presentation. Also, regarding cost savings, are initial investments in infrastructure calculated? And is the cost for interconnection fees considered, as well as space to store and charging? And will there be funding available to subsidize the significant infrastructure investments required for electrification? And then last questions regarding LCFS. It's been mentioned that there's a lot of credits available for the zero emission forklifts. But how much in your calculations does LCFS contribute to your total savings? And if it is a significant contributor, are you going to guarantee that there's a continuation of these credits for the duration of the phase out?
Okay, so just high level response to just overall in terms of our assumptions. What we've provided is are just very preliminary numbers. We're working on this SRIA we call the Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment. And that right now is kind of going through our review process and it's not final yet. So I don't want to talk about kind of exactly kind of how we came to these assumptions until that document is final. And that, as we indicated in the in our slides here, is going to be released, I believe, in like the at the latest by like the April timeframe, I believe. Let me just like double check that. Yeah, April timeframe. And then at that point, you know, stakeholders will have a chance to kind of go in and look in detail how we came to all their different assumptions and basically comment on those. I can kind of give you like maybe just like a general kind of summary on how we came to things. And so in terms of the actual electrical rate, I think you asked about that. I mean, it was based on the CARB's truck and bus calculator. Would basically there's it doesn't include every rate schedule, right? But it includes like kind of the main rate schedules of like each major utility. And then we went in there and we just tried to kind of based on fleet demand, anticipated fleet demand, kind of like predict kind of which rate schedules people would use. And based on those, we kind of just derived a weighted average based on that. But how it affects what an actual rate is for an actual fleet is going to vary significantly. I mean, the range of rates vary very greatly. I mean, we're talking to, you know, some folks in these rural communities who have rates that are about double that, right? And so just because that's the average doesn't mean that's going to be the actual rate that's paid by a specific fleet. It's going to really depend on what utility they're under and, you know, what rate schedule they're on, what their existing demand is and stuff like that. The LCFS credit assumption, again, was based on just the projections that LCFS releases. They have I don't remember the exact name of the document. I'm sorry, I apologize for that, but they kind of release some kind of projected rate LCFS credit values. And so again, that will all kind of be discussed in detail when we release our SRIA in April, and you'll be able to kind of comment on that, and we'll respond to comments at that time. I mean, that'll be part of kind of our official rulemaking record. In terms of infrastructure, our cost assumptions do include infrastructure, and so there are assumed costs for infrastructure in there. And I'm not sure, was there any other question you had that I missed, Krista? Apologize.
About funding available for infrastructure investments.
Okay, so I mean, for funding, it might be where, you know, I know the California Energy Commission has like an incentive program for infrastructure. It's called Energize, and some utilities have programs to help facilities pay for necessary infrastructure. One of the bills that was not necessarily recent, I think a few years ago, enacted was Assembly Bill 841, and that allows utilities basically to spread infrastructure costs for zero emission equipment and vehicles among all ratepayers. So it basically spreads out the cost instead of just the fleet itself that needs the infrastructure to kind of bear that entire cost of any utility site upgrade. And on the facility side, again, I know that the Energy Commission does have programs, but not sure exactly. I can't speak to how much money is there or how much money is being made available for that specific purpose.
For the LCFS credits, so what percentage of that is your total and savings? Because it's mentioned LCFS, fuel and maintenance savings, but what percentage out of your total cost savings is LCFS?
I honestly don't have that information offhand. Maybe once we release the SRIA, we can talk with you after that, and you can provide your feedback.
And I'm also curious if you guys are calculating the cost savings transitioning to electric from all different fuel types, because those are all different, propane versus diesel versus gas.
Well, this rule is just for large spark ignition engines, and so it only really includes LSI and propane and gasoline, and maybe there's some like alcohol fuels or something out there, but that's not something we're evaluating because we're really not aware of how many of those or if they're out there. But not diesels, because our rule doesn't apply to diesels.
Okay, and so do you know, again, are the LCFS credits going to be guaranteed for zero emission forklifts throughout the duration of the phase out?
No, can't guarantee that. I mean, the thing is LCF credits itself is a market driven. The price of LCF credits is market driven. And, you know, the LCFS program continues to evolve over time. And so, yeah, I mean, to be frank, we can't guarantee that the LCFS credit will be there for the duration of the phase out. And we can't guarantee the value of those credits either. But we did make an assumption of a credit value in our analysis, which again will be will be published when we release our standardized regulatory impact assessment. Any other follow-up? Okay, thank you, Krista.
Okay, our next written question comes from Brian Harris. This new or revised regulation is effective for Class 4 and Class 5 starting January 2026.
I think, Brian, that was the question you asked when you raised your hand. But yeah, so you know the restriction to buy affected forklifts will start in 2026, and then the phase out will depend on like your fleet size and which class of forklift you're talking about. So if that's not your question, please maybe you can type it in again with a little bit more detail on what you're looking for. Sorry about that. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, David. The next question is from Benjamin Morgan. Currently, only diesel-powered forklifts are subject to the cargo handling equipment rule. Currently, propane forklifts operating at a marine terminal are subject to the LSI rule. Please confirm that propane forklifts operating at marine terminals will not be subject to the zero-emission forklift rule.
Yeah, so I mean, we've been early on when we started this rule, we had a lot of discussions with our cargo handling equipment rule folks, and at that time we decided that it would make sense for them to kind of deal with any facilities that fall under their purview, kind of as a whole in their next zero emission rule. And so, if you're talking about a terminal or a location of marine terminal that is subject to the current cargo handling equipment rule, our concept right now does not include those forklifts, those LSI forklifts. So they are not those forklifts, if they're operating at a facility subject to the current cargo handling equipment rule, regardless if they're LSI, would not fall under our regulation, at least based on the concept today. Now, if you don't think that makes sense, we're willing to talk about it. So if you want to reach out to us and advocate for it, including it in our rule, you know, you're certainly free to do that, and we can continue discussions with the cargo handling folks here to figure out what's the best approach. Thanks.
Thank you, David. The next question is from Gary Ma. Is the draft regulatory language with the new concepts already posted, or is it going to be released soon?
It's already posted. So if you go to our zero emission forklift page, meetings and workshops, you'll see the
So
wait,
just,
the slides from today are already posted. The regulatory language is to be released.
Yeah.
We haven't told you the specific date yet. Sorry, I misinterpreted. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Stephen Yang and Mike Gazer ask a very similar question, and that has to do with the definition of a large fleet. Is it still 26 forklifts or more?
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Kim. Our next question comes from Michelle Watson. On slide 20, why does class 4 have a 10-year phase out and class 5 has a 13-year phase out?
So,
statement continues the same engines, but just different applications.
The class 4 forklifts, I mean, that category forklifts, the zero emission replacements for those are just a much more mature technology in that class. And so we figured that warranted, we decided that warranted like we could phase those out quicker essentially than the class 5s, which there are zero emission models available, and based on what we know, they have like there's coverage for all lift capacities, and there might, but it is more of an emerging space. Zero emission is still kind of an emerging kind of technology in the class 5 space. And so we thought, that it probably warrants to give them a little bit more time to phase out those forklifts to zero emission.
Thank you, David. Next question comes from Marshall. We have seen a ton of frustration and additional cost on class 8 road tractor users in the last few years with emission changes. There are not enough qualified technicians now for those trucks, and now for forklifts is going to cause major backups. Attachment draw is also an issue or concern.
So thanks for the comment. And what the issue that you're pointing to is definitely real. Like there's going to be, as there's a transition to more zero emission equipment, there's going to be a commensurate need for technicians that know how to take care of that equipment. In general, the systems on a zero emission piece of equipment are simpler, and there's less maintenance costs. There's less things to break and maintain, but that doesn't mean that there's zero maintenance. So yeah, we do expect the technicians to sort of evolve just as the equipment rolls out there. And as far as attachment draw, if you're talking about towing, then that is definitely something we're considering as part of our feasibility exemptions. But if attachment draw means something else, please comment subsequently to clarify that.
Thank you, Kim. Our next commenter is Micah Perez. Are there any upcoming discussions regarding, oh, hang on, things are moving, sorry. Are there any upcoming discussions regarding the massive increase of lead acid batteries in the California market, particularly the flat plate models that have lead and burning of lead on the top surface? Will safer, more environmentally friendly battery solutions be looked at as well?
So as part of our environmental review that we are in process of doing as part of this rulemaking, definitely like battery related impacts are one thing that we have to look at. So we will be examining that. Generally, looking at the forklift manufacturers, most are moving to more of a lithium ion battery rather than lead acid battery. So at least that would mitigate that concern.
Thank you, Kim. Bruce Farber asks, I concur with Martin Boyd regarding lowest rated lift capacity phrasing. Weight directly relates to battery and hydrogen fuel requirements. The higher the weight, the more battery or hydrogen fuel needed to meet work cycle demands.
So I'll take that. So thank you, Bruce. I think this is probably going to necessitate like more detailed discussion. So I would say, feel free to contact us after this work group to discuss. If anybody else also online wants to kind of chime in on this, feel free to contact us after the workshop. But this does seem like it probably needs a little bit more in-depth discussion. Thank you.
All right, Kayla Kokila asked a question that I believe Kim just provided the response for. Are there any exemptions if you need to tow load large parts on a trailer? Kim, you want to just reinforce
Yeah,
that one?
yeah. So yeah, this using spark ignition forklifts to tow things was a usage that we weren't aware of before we started this rulemaking. And so we would definitely appreciate hearing from folks. We are aware that at some like vineyard slash winery type applications that is done. But if folks can share more information with us about where they're currently using forklifts for towing, that'd be helpful. That isn't a use that is typically like designed for from the manufacturer's perspective, but we are aware that people actually do use them in the real world for that sometimes. And yeah, as I mentioned before, Holmes, that would be the sort of situation where we'd be, it could be applicable for the feasibility exemption. If someone's towing and the electrics can't handle the towing, that would be, that provision would be relevant in that situation.
Great, thank you. Daniel Langmaid asks, do you have an idea of the LSI rough terrain forklift inventory in California if you're stating that there aren't a lot?
And I think Corey Palmer was going to take this question.
Hello, yes, this is Corey Palmer with the emission inventory. So our current estimate for LSI rough terrain is about 300 units in the state. That compares against maybe 10,000 diesel rough terrain forklifts and then over 90,000 non-rough terrain forklifts. We'll cover this in a little bit more detail in an inventory presentation in about 15 minutes.
Thank you, Corey. Kirsten Melville asks, on slide 21, is it correct to assume for a large fleet that you start with model year 2018 phase outs on January 1st of 2028, but then the next phase out is not until January 1st, 2031 for model year 2019 through 2021? Also, can you repeat what the definition of a large fleet is?
I can take this one. Could you display slide 21, people, please, so that people can see what we're talking about? Okay, thanks. Yeah, you're interpreting that correctly. So as of as shown in the two rightmost columns, our current proposal is shown in the two rightmost columns for large fleets. And again, a large fleet is defined as owning 26 affected forklifts or more. As of January 1st, 2028, you'd need to have gotten rid of your 2018 model year and older spark ignition forklifts. So that would have to be completed by January 1st of 2028, not begun then. And then, yeah, you're reading it correctly that then the next date by which you'd have to do something is January 1st, 2031 for the next couple model years.
Thank you. Daniel Langmaid asks, for the emergency exemption, why wouldn't you just copy or use similar language to what is in the off-road regulation or truck and bus regulation?
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for that question. So I think at this point, like, we're just trying to figure out whether there is going to be a need for an emergency operations exemption. We're just like not sure how like LSI forklifts are used to respond to emergencies. And I think that's kind of like where we're at. We're kind of like in that early stages trying to figure out, do we even need this? But certainly if we are going to start like putting in language for things like in our concept, that we'd be looking to the off-road rule and other rules as well to see kind of what they've done. And, you know, if we would try to align as much as it made sense. But, you know, at this point, what we're just kind of looking for information. It's like, tell us how these things are used in emergency operations so we can figure out whether there is a need for such an exemption. Thank you.
Thank you, David. The next question is from Stephen Yang. Does the low use exemption of less than 200 hours per year apply to each forklift or the fleet? Also, can you confirm there is no rental forklift allowance?
Yeah, so the 200 hours applies to one forklift. So in the beginning, fleets will be able to have 10% of their fleet be low use, and so designated as low use. And so each of those forklifts can do 200 hours. But in terms of the rental forklift allowance, I think what you're referring to is kind of what we had in our previous concept where there was like a specific procedure to rent a forklift and it was only allowed in certain cases. But I think we're kind of getting rid of that, and you can rent an LSI forklift as long as it hasn't been phased out yet, based on the model year phase out schedule. So fleets would be free to rent forklifts as long as they haven't been phased out yet. I think that's the answer you're looking for, but if not, please enter your question with maybe a little bit more detail on that. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Next, we have Brian Harris asking if reporting of all internal combustion powered forklifts using the EIN number will continue.
I'm not sure. So, I mean, right now, under in the previously published concept, that's what we have, where everybody's reporting like a snapshot of their forklifts, and that includes their entire fleet, and they would all be issued EIN numbers, EIN equipment identification numbers by CARB. But like we've been saying, we're trying to kind of reduce necessary reporting. So it's possible that when we do our updated regulatory draft, it may not require reporting of all forklifts in every situation. So I hope that answers your question, but thank you, Brian.
Thanks, David. Gary Ma asks, does the low use limitation of 10% still start in 2026? As previously communicated to your staff, we have concerns with the 10% limitation and would prefer a phase out approach for low use forklifts as well, due to our high number of current low use designated forklifts. Note, I will likely follow up with your staff later as I will need to drop off soon. And this is at 9:53, so I would assume we can follow up with Gary later, but David, did you want to provide a quick response?
I think, and I'd just say for Gary to follow up with us after following the workshop to kind of just discuss this in more detail. But the limitation does start in 2026. So I think if that was his first question.
Yes, it was. Thank you. Next comes from Brian Harris. What will happen when a user who does not follow the rules proposed, meaning what penalty will be implemented or imposed?
I can take that one. So they'd be subject to potential notices of violation and monetary penalties, and the exact penalties to be determined based on the exact situation. So I can't give like a dollar figure.
Thank you, Kim. No one wants a notice of violation. Mark Feynman asks, on slide 33, what is the idea of a definition of emergency operations? Would it be government agency only, or be in response to a disaster, or would it include a situation like a plant fire and replacement electric truck to restore operations cannot be found in a reasonable time frame?
I think what we were thinking was like disasters or something like that, some major disaster, but that's a good question. I think like if you do have like thoughts on that, please contact us. I mean, I'm not sure like there would be even an LSI forklift unless it was like a dedicated fleet for someone to rent in it, like, if like there's some type of event that at a facility that needs addressing or something. And if you think, I guess there's a need for a fleet like that, I don't know, like I would say just come talk to us about it. Like, but I would say initially our thought was more of like kind of major like statewide disasters, like wildfires or something like that, where there's like a declaration of emergency. But certainly if there are other situations you think should be included, we'd like to hear them. Thanks.
Okay. Next written question is from Carrie Beck. When estimating emission reductions on slide 40, have you taken into consideration the high carbon footprint of manufacturing lithium-ion batteries, the demand for which will be greatly increased by this legislation?
Hello, this is Corey again. This is a good question. Currently, the emission inventory only accounts for the tailpipe emissions and then the carbon intensity of California's electric grid. To do the upstream analysis, which I think would be very interesting, we would need a lot of information from the manufacturers and then would have to compare that to the sort of also the carbon cost of producing and transporting the fuels for LSI forklifts. So if you have information or studies on that that you want to share with us, we'd be interested. But the direct and simple answer to the question is right now we're looking at tailpipe versus grid emissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. Kyle Schmidt asks, what are you assuming is the typical usable lifespan of a lift? Put another way, was there any consideration for a business needing to replace a lift before 5.9 or 7.2 years? In other words, not netting a return on investment.
Hello, this is Corey again. Good question. So in the inventory, we look at the average age of each fleet. So there's some fleets that are very young and they keep their lifts only a few years, and others keep them for quite a long time. And we forecast using that. So, but I will say the average, if you look at everything, is maybe about 9 to 11 years. That's sort of a normal useful life. And we most definitely reflect when the regulation would push turnover faster than somebody would naturally replace something. That's why there's a net cost to the regulation. So we do understand that, reflected in the cost analysis. Those costs are related to earlier turnover than would otherwise be required, along with any difference in cost.
Thank you again, Corey. Ryan Huggins asks, on slides 45 and 46, could CARB please share further details behind the return on investment analysis? For example, forklift battery capacity or the fuel maintenance, LCFS broken out into separate values.
So I responded to a similar question about this before. So we haven't finalized our cost analysis. So we're not going to release any like very specific details about our cost analysis and our assumptions, and that will be released as part of our SRIA, which is should be published sometime in the early April timeframe at the latest. One thing I can say is I got some information from my staff is that in terms of the $7,300 savings annually on the on slide 44, that at least in that number, $1,100 was assumed to be the value of the LCFS credits, $1,800 was maintenance savings, and $4,400 was fuel savings. If anybody is curious about that, I know.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, thank you.
Next question comes from Mark Feynman again, slide 36. What is your thinking on dealers' rental fleets? Would they follow the rental agency rules for that rental fleet, or would they not be able to use the, hang on a second, this is written a little strangely, not be able to use the class 5s to 2029 proposal?
Yeah, I think the way it would work out is that fleet, that dealer would also be a rental agency. And so as a rental agency, that rental fleet would be subject to the same provisions that other rental fleets would be subject to, and then the dealer side would be subject to the dealer side requirements. I don't know, that just kind of brought up another question in my mind, is like, what if those fleets are kind of mixed or something? I don't know, maybe that's not a real life scenario, but yeah. Anyways, yes, but a dealer that rents forklifts would be subject, for their rental fleet, subject to the same requirements as other rental fleets. Thanks, Mark.
Great. And just to mention, we do really appreciate all this great feedback. Obviously, we've got a lot of considerations to make. Sid McIntyre asks, where does California plan to generate this energy from to support the grid?
Okay, I can take that one. Well, yeah, obviously there's a lot of thinking going into this, and it's led by agencies other than the California Air Resources Board. Generally, there's a transition underway to non-carbon based fuel sources like wind and solar. But if you want more detail, I would refer you to the California Energy Commission, and they have a bunch of more detailed information regarding energy planning efforts for the state.
Thank you for that insight. Jamie Doneth asks, regarding the saving calculations on slide 42 and 45, can you please discuss the assumptions regarding LCFS credit generation that are part of the savings obtained from purchases of zero-emission forklifts? Should one infer that CARB has no plans to limit LCFS credit generation from charging of electric forklifts for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, so I think I responded to a similar question about this. And so in terms of the actual LCFS credit value assumption, that's going to be in our SURIA when we release that. Should one infer that CARB has no plans to limit LCFS credit generation? No, one should not infer that. Like I said, the LCFS program evolves over time, and they do make updates to that program. And so there's no guarantee these credits will still be available for the duration of the phase out, which is like what I had responded before. But thank you.
And we have a related question from Aman Ahmed Norden. More of a comment than a question. Workshops are underway for LCFS expansion, and one of the items CARB raised was phasing out electric forklifts from eligibility to participate in the program. That may affect the annual savings bottom line. I think we can move on to Grant Stickney. It appears the cost analysis here does not take into account multiple ship operations. ICE-powered lift can be internal combustion engine powered lifts can be operated for multiple shifts. Where are ZEVs at for limited one shift or less?
Okay, so I think Grant, you meant shifts, right? In that first sentence, appears to cost less.
Yes, my apologies for not catching that when I read the question. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So we have an assumption in terms of how many hours a forklift typically an LSI forklift typically operates. We didn't do for the ROI slides. Those were just kind of examples, right? We didn't do an examples of a multi-shift operation, but we certainly could in the future if that's something that would be valuable. But in terms of our cost analysis and our emissions analysis, we pull a like an average operating hours number from the inventory, and that's what we use that's what we assume for our costs and emissions analysis. And so I just got pinged by our inventory folks saying that it's about time for them to do their little presentation on the inventory model. So maybe it'd be a good time to kind of hand it off to them, and then we'll take more questions on the zero-emission forklift rulemaking, maybe following their presentation and discussion. So if there's like no objection from the panelists, then maybe we can just hand it off to Corey and Nancy at this time.
Sounds good. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Corey.
And I think in a moment, the presentation for the LSI inventory will pop up. And just a note, this is available online as well at the same location as the LSI rulemaking. And with that, I'll hand it off to Nancy Bowie.
Thanks, Corey. So again, Welcome to the second public workshop on our draft, now 2023 large spark ignition or forklift equipment emissions inventory. If you're just joining in, the intent of this section of the workshop is to share the data and methods we use to develop our baseline inventory, highlighting those changes that we made based on feedback that you gave us from our first workshop held back in April 2022. Most importantly, though, we're really just hoping to understand your thoughts and ideas before we turn into making the final edits to this draft inventory in late February. If we run out of time for questions during the scheduled workshop session, please note we do plan to address any remaining inventory questions via email after the workshop concludes. Next slide, please. Okay. Again, if you're just joining in, this is a quick overview of your Zoom webinar controls. It'll pop up again towards the end of our slide deck when we get to our dedicated Q&A session too. But you're welcome to submit your comments anytime through the question and answer window. If you want to make a verbal comment, again, if you're on the phone, *9 to raise or lower your hand, *6 to mute or toggle mute. And as always, if you'd rather not comment during this webinar, we do have our email contact listed at the end of this slide deck. And feel free to send us an email on any of your thoughts by February 23rd. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a high-level look at our large spark ignition or LSI inventory. It does include rated horsepowers greater than 25, powered by electricity, liquid or gaseous propane, natural gas, and gasoline. This inventory does include forklifts, sweeper scrubbers, and tow tractors as we're presenting it, but only forklift equipment from this inventory will be considered in the zero-emission forklift rulemaking as the baseline. Next slide, please. So these are our data sources. This inventory has a base year of 2020 and integrates sales data, our LSI database indoors reporting, and a fleet average age forecasting method. And we'll walk through each of those things in more detail in a later slide. We're relying on three major population data sources as shown in the table here, primarily our doors reporting for large fleets, the Fullerton survey to get a sense of reasonable proportions of small fleets compared to large fleet populations. And when we say small fleets, we mean those fleet operators with 3 pieces of equipment or less that aren't required to currently report into the doors database. So we also have California sales information for forklifts, helps us understand electric forklifts not required to report into doors, as well as those new forklifts coming in. Activity hours are coming from a side doors fleet survey we conducted in 2020. We are using our standard emissions factors, and I'll touch base on how those were derived from our certification database in a later slide. And then we'll have our regional allocations we're applying to statewide emissions. This is based on warehouse industrial square footage. Next slide, please. Okay, the doors reporting database is the primary data set for this inventory. It's called the Diesel Off-Road Online Reporting System. It's an online tool designated to help fleet operators report off-road equipment and track their progress towards equipment emissions reductions, really motivated by 2 regulations, right? So the first one is the in-use off-road fleets regulation, primarily diesel equipment, and the other regulation is the large spark ignition engine fleet requirements regulation. So from an inventory perspective, this means that annual reporting, is required into this database for large fleet operators, generally over 25 horsepower, more than 19 kilowatts for model year engines 2005 or older. Again, large fleet that I'm mentioning here is different from the regulatory one. It just means if it's not a small fleet, so if it has more than 4 units of equipment, it has to report into this database. So as we worked through this inventory, we did see that some LSI equipment aren't reported into doors, and we'll walk through some approaches that we're taking and how we're going to address that gap in this inventory. We'll detail that in a later slide. So next slide, please. Our emissions factors are based on engine certification data. This is submitted by engine manufacturers to the US EPA and to CARB annually. These reports detail emissions as they're tested from the engines every year with whatever applicable engine standard may be for that engine. So since there can be a deviation based on make and model, emissions factors are actually updated based on the overall average by fuel type, model year, horsepower, and type of equipment across all of these manufacturers rather than a single one per manufacturer. Off-road engine emissions factors were actually updated in 2017, and we continue to use them in this inventory and many of our other off-road models. In the second half of this slide, you'll see that a simplified version of 2 of our main equations for this inventory. So the first equation you see here is for our emissions factors in grams per horsepower hour. There's 2 main components to this equation. The first one is the 0-hour emissions, which actually represents what we think a brand new engine would emit at its most pristine state, right? And that second portion of the equation is a deterioration and accumulated hours. And essentially this represents the wear and tear on the engine as it gets used. The older the equipment is, the more it may emit, right? Because it's less efficient overall. So these emissions factors are derived using this equation and pulled into the next equation when we think about emissions from each particular piece of equipment. So we actually consider population of the equipment, total hours of annual use, engine horsepower, and average load on the engine as a percentage. And then the unique emissions factor, again, applied for the engine based on fuel type, horsepower, and equipment type. And so we're continuing to use load averages from our prior inventory for LSI equipment, and that is about a 30% load. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we're trying to estimate a total statewide population, we do use data from ITA, the Industrial Truck Association. This is a sales data set that suggests there should be at least 77,000 forklifts operating in California. So due to some exemptions in LSI reg and the existing rule and underreporting, there's not all equipment aren't reported into the DOORS database, right? So we're not capturing the full California population, and we do recognize this. So what we've done is we've developed a method to help scale that population using fleet characteristics from DOORS plus available sales data and other data sources to try to develop the most accurate statewide total possible. Next slide, please. So in this slide is an example of what we're doing to scale that population. So like I said before, ITA associate members indoors, we're seeing there's about 4 forklifts for every non-associated ITA forklift. So this suggests that there are some forklifts in California that aren't reporting into DOORS, and we think that's about 17,000 forklifts. And so in that first line that you see there, we have the 77,000 represented by ITA and DOORS, plus that 17,000, which is how we're getting to that 94,000 that, again, the reg team mentioned before in their slide deck as well. And so the bottom section is how we're actually scaling for that 94,000 that we think exists in California. So 28,000 is from the doors reporting, right? So this is the equipment subject to the LSI regulation and are reporting into doors. We're adding in 14,000 as what we're thinking is the small fleet population. And again, we're using that Fullerton survey to understand the proportion of small fleets to large fleets reported indoors. And then again, we have to add in 52,000 to reach that 94,000 target. So what we're doing is we're adding in this population with the same characteristics, size, age, engine parameters as what's reported indoors, because that's our real life observations, of these engines. So that's how we're getting to that 94,000 in the final base year population for LSI forklifts. Happy to answer any slides. Please pop them into the chat if you have them. Otherwise, next slide, please. Okay, so this is a survival curve. And so when we're taking ITA sales data and our other sales data sets, we're putting them through a survival curve. And essentially what that means is that we're using doors reported fleets to see what the retirement rate would be. And so it's essentially showing expected retirement for each new forklift purchase, right? So on the horizontal axes, we see the percent of in-use population. The age on the bottom is essentially when we expect a new purchase to retire. And so from this curve shown for propane-powered forklifts, we can see that in the first 5 years of sale, we're not expecting any of these equipment to retire. By age 10, we're expecting about 40% of new forklifts to be retired. And then at age 10, by age 18, most of these new sales will be retired, though according to doors, we do see a few pieces of equipment lingering for a bit longer. Next slide, please. Okay. So this slide gives us a snapshot of the statewide population as we're seeing in the base year. It is split out by equipment type and fuel type. We include diesel forklifts on this slide just for reference only. They're not actually included in the LSI inventory. So what we have here are stacked bars, where the bottommost green portion of the bars depicts the population that is reported into our doors database. On top of that, we have the additional population we estimate are from small fleets, not required to report into doors. And lastly, that yellow topmost portion of the bars represents other equipment not yet reported into doors. And so you can see in this slide that we estimate about 77,000 LSI forklifts exist statewide. There was a prior question in the question and answer box about rough terrain forklifts. I do want to comment that you can see here that there are 4 LSI rough terrain forklifts. However, we do believe that those forklifts may be lifts replacing diesel forklifts in the in-use inventory. So we recognize that LSI rough terrain lifts aren't required to report into the system. So that could be explained why they aren't really represented here. As Corey mentioned previously in his response, we do believe about 300 rough terrain LSI forklifts exist statewide, even though they're not currently required to report into our system. Okay, next slide, please. Here we have an average, here we have our statewide base year age distribution split out by fuel type. On the horizontal axis, we have statewide hours of operation from all pieces of equipment. In our inventory, we can see that the equipment between the ages of 2 and 5 are used the most statewide, with propane equipment being the most widely used, though there are quite a bit of electric equipment already being used statewide. In the table on the right, corner, we have the average age of these equipment by fuel type for reference. Okay, next slide, please. In this slide, we're sharing the population weighted hours per unit. So this is split out by fuel type, separate bars each for engine model year grouping, denoted in the legend at the top. Generally, we see older model year engines aren't being used as much as the newer equipment, and the forklifts seem to be between 1,500 and 2,000 hours per year on average for annual use. Next slide, please. Okay, so future year equipment is projected based on fleet purchasing habits observed in the base year 2020. And it takes into account three things. First, fleets maintain the base year average age. So if the fleet exceeds the current average age and needs to be replaced, then the oldest equipment will be replaced. Finally, fleets only purchase as new as the youngest equipment that they had in the base year. Essentially, this maintains the assumption that young fleets will continue to purchase newer equipment in forecasted years, while older fleets will continue to purchase used equipment in forecasted years. And so, next slide, please. In this is actually a visual example of the concepts I mentioned in the prior slide. So we're taking an actual forklift operator in the inventory with 5 forklifts in their fleet, as shown in the center of the slide. The first row of this table, you can see the base year observation that we have for them. So what our model will do is essentially look for the youngest piece of equipment. In this case, for this operator, it happens to be a 7-year-old forklift. And it'll also look for the average of all 5 forklifts from this operator, which is about 12 years old, as seen in the second column from the right there. These 2 pieces of information actually get stored and is used in future forecasted years to help us forecast replacement for this operator. So for example, in that second row there, 2021, we can see that the average age of those forklifts do exceed the base year average age of 12. And so what happens is that forklift in our model will turn over the oldest piece of equipment. There's 2, so it'll just turn over 1 because that's the amount necessary to get below that base year average age, right? So this operator is purchasing a used age 7 piece of equipment to replace that age 17 piece of equipment. And this continues into each forecasted year as the operator continues to replace equipment. And this is how we can maintain unique behavior found for each fleet operator in the base year. We can maintain those averages through each forecasted calendar year through 2050 for our baseline inventory. Okay, next slide, please. This is the regional spatial allocation. So we estimate emissions statewide, but we regionally allocate those emissions based on industrial warehouse square footage within each air district. This is based on census parcel information. And as you can see, South Coast Air District has 47% of industrial warehouse square footage and will therefore receive 40% allocation of these emissions. And we do that for each area in the state. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have the results from our inventory forecast. This is showing you statewide NOx emissions in tons per day, forecasted from 2020 to 2050. You can see forklifts, sweeper scrubbers, and tow tractors on this figure, as well as our estimate from our prior inventory, off-road 2007. And so what you can see here is that we do have a more population than we anticipated from our off-road 2007 model. So there is an increase in NOx just from the excess populations that we're adding in here. However, in future forecasted years, you can see as model years are turning over based on average age and less deterioration, we have emissions expected to be lower than we previously forecasted from the off-road 2007 model. Next slide, please. Here you can see PM emissions. So particulate emissions don't have as stringent standards as NOx, right? And so you can see the impact of just additional forklifts being estimated in our inventory compared to our prior model here. Next slide, please. We did estimate increased energy demand on the grid from the proposed zero-emission forklift regulation. And so what we have here for you is in 2020, existing electric forklift demand. And then the second bar on the right here is what would happen if the LSI were converted to electric due to replacement. So we're doing this based on fuel consumption only. And so you can see power in megawatt hours increasing, but relatively not by much compared to what's already the grid demand for existing electric forklifts. Okay, thank you. So next steps, again, we had our first workshop in April 2022, and we wrote in those comments that you gave to us up to today, and we're hoping from the second public workshop that you'll give us some additional comments so we can take them through February 23rd. Again, we have 30 days to get your comments and make our final edits. Okay, so next slide, please. Again, this is a reminder of your Zoom webinar controls if you need them. And we'd be happy to go into a question and answer session.
Okay, so do we have any hands up?
We currently don't have any. Oh, we just received one from Krista Weiner. I have unmuted your mic. Go ahead and ask your question. Krista, can you unmute?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Krista Warner with Western Propane Gas Association. Just a few questions regarding breakdowns of data calculations. Curious if there's a distinction on the NOx and PM emissions model year to model year, like older versus newer, and if that difference is significant. And then if there's a breakdown of comparable data available for emissions for all fuel types. I see that they were kind of grouped by equipment type. And then if there's not, are you planning on identifying these types of emissions from individual fuel sources? And do the calculations for overall emission reductions include emissions from electricity generation?
Hi, thank you for your comment. So we don't include emissions from electricity generation in this inventory. We're just including emissions from our fueled equipment. In regards to the different emissions factors, we did have a slide in our prior inventory, the first workshop that we held. It is available on our workshop, and you can see the breakdown of all of the different emissions factors by fuel type and horsepower. If you shoot us an email, let us know if you can't find it. We do have those available on our website. And there's also additional resources with the different emissions factors between the two.
And is there, has it been distinguished model year to model year, the difference in emissions?
Yeah, so those should be outlined in our resources. There are significant differences depending on model year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And I'll just cover, we have just one comment so far in the written portion, which is Brian Harris noted that I think 68% of all new forklifts sold in California in 2022 were electric powered units through the different classes. And I'll just note that we do recognize that an increasing proportion has been electric, and I think we saw it cross over to be the majority in 2020. So that's very good news. And we're very happy to see that as well. And so with that, I think with no more hands up or written comments, I think we'll jump back into general questions for the regulation, although feel free to, of course, add more in for the inventory as well.
Okay, maybe I'll take the first one. So at 10:06, Carrie Beck asked, as I understand this, diesel trucks are not affected, correct? And yep, that is correct. This is only, we're only forcing phase out of spark ignition forklifts.
Thank you, Kim. Next question is from Roger Issam. We do not agree with the electricity cost estimate of 18 cents per kilowatt hour. Can you please provide the documentation demonstrating how you arrived at that number? The bulk of agricultural operations will fall under PG&E rate tariffs, and they are higher than 18 cents per kilowatt hour, and they have a GRC rate increase request of 45% right now.
I can take this one. Roger, thanks for the comment. And we totally acknowledge that agricultural rates are often much higher than the average that we used. And we will be taking that into account in our cost analysis. And we're happy to provide the exact references for costs privately to you, and then it'll also appear in our SRIA, which will be released within the next couple months. We have references for all the costs and assumptions that we have in there.
Thank you, Kim. Edgardo Gonzalez asks about the WARE program. They are on the WARE program and would like to know if the purchase of new or existing forklifts will be considered for points towards the program.
Thanks for the question. The WARE program is a program specific to the South Coast Air Quality Management District regarding their warehouse regulation. I did a little quick research during this workshop. I do not believe that forklifts provide any credit in that. However, please check with the South Coast Air District because it is their program, and it's definitely possible that there's a provision that wasn't obvious on their program webpage.
I'll just add that I directly contacted them a few months ago, and they said forklifts were not included in the WARE program.
Thanks, David.
Holmes, did you want us just to maybe read the questions from now on, since it seems,
Sure, that works.
I don't know. Chris Ransom asks, will biofuels be considered for exemptions? No, this rule's zero emission rule at the point source. So no, they're not. Pete Thomas asked, regarding the prohibition of class 4 sales starting January 1st, 2026, is this for new and used equipment or new only? And that's for new only. So you will be able to buy used after 2026, January 1st, 2026, as long as the model year has not been phased out yet, according to the phase out schedule. We have one raised hand there. Did we want to jump over there and take that one?
Sure. The question is from Edward Barton. I have just unmuted your mic. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yes, my name is Edward Barton with CAL FIRE Mobile Equipment, and just concerns on our end as far as the emergency equipment and how forklift is used in our industry. Typically, the forklift is used in an instant situation, so we'll bring the equipment out at a high school or a fairgrounds, or sometimes in the forest there, and we're trying to utilize this equipment to load waters for our people, and to get products out there to the staff that's out there fighting the fires. So the main concern is that we already run into emissions hindering what we're doing with as far as the on-road and off-road diesel programs with our dozers and equipment and the engine apparatuses themselves. So the concern would be, we would like to see an exemption on our forklifts also, because it is used in that same capacity as, life-saving equipment and, for structure fires and our wildland incidents.
Yeah, thank you, Edward, for that question. Are those forklifts like part of a dedicated emergency response fleet?
That would be negative. Typically, they would be at a location, and we have 21 different incident command centers throughout the state. So they would be assigned a couple forklifts, and when that area was dispatched to respond to an incident, those forklifts would be utilized in that capacity. So we have a lot of small fleets, if you will, with 2 forklifts, but they could be utilized or activated at any time for wherever the fire location might be.
Okay, thank you. Do you mind if we maybe reach out to you after the workshop and maybe talk a little bit more in depth about your operation?
Of course.
Okay. I mean, and you registered, and so we should have your information, I believe.
Correct.
But, yeah. Okay, great. And thank you, Edward.
Thank you.
I just want to do a time check. So we initially had scheduled this workshop to run 3 hours, 9 to 12. We still have, I think, 34 questions to get through. So we're going to keep going and answer those questions. I think we can all stay on for at least the next hour. If anybody asked a question and they need to hop off now, of course, that's fine. We are going to be recording this, so you can always hop on later and watch the answer to your question later on the recording, or you can reach out to us separately if you don't feel like watching the recording.
Great. Okay, I guess we'll just go back to the written questions.
Okay, so I can take one from Brian Harris from 10:14 a.m. Brian asks, what about a customer who ships equipment to California in cases where the ultimate destination is Hawaii or Mexico? Does that mean we would have to find other ways to get the equipment to those customers? Or could we ship to California knowing the units will not be used in the state? I don't believe we currently have any provisions addressing that situation in this regulation. However, I do know others of our regulations do take that into account, like if a product is just sort of passing through California and it's not for use here. So I expect we would be able to work out similar language for this regulation. And I would encourage Mr. Harris to work with us separately if he has specific suggestions for how we handle that. So thank you for bringing that situation up. That's definitely a real situation, and appreciate you raising it.
Okay, so the next question here is from Alvin Chu from 10:14 a.m. Are labeling requirements and reporting on the renter or the rentee if the forklift is in a long-term lease? And so the labeling requirements are closely tied to the reporting. So as I was saying earlier, we are trying to kind of reduce and streamline the reporting. So based on kind of what we've said previously, things could change. And I just wanted to kind of put that out there. One thing that we need to do and we haven't done yet is to kind of delineate when a forklift is part of the fleet operator's fleet and when it would be part of like the rental agency's fleet. And so that is something we still need to work on. I think it's like, just kind of off the top of my head, something like if it's a 12-month plus rental or lease, maybe it would be part of like the fleet operator's fleet. And then if not, then it's the rental agency's fleet. So, but overall, these things are kind of evolving at this moment. And so hopefully we'll have it all kind of nailed down before we release any draft language, which we'll try to get out in the next couple months. And so you'll be able to kind of look at what we've done there and provide feedback. Thank you.
Take the next one. Todd Troman asks, the LCFS group has implied they may adjust how crediting works for electric forklifts, potentially limiting or eliminating altogether as early as sometime in 2024. Have your groups connected about this? How can we ensure revenue will be available from the LCFS program? What you say is true. They are considering some possible changes to how electric forklift use is credited. And I would encourage, if you have an opinion about how they should do that, would encourage encourage you to participate in their process. They haven't put in any sort of official proposal yet, but they have held a couple of meetings to discuss this among many other LCFS related issues. We are working closely with them, and I expect for our staff report, we'll likely calculate or estimate our costs and savings using the current LCFS provisions, but also we'll run a sensitivity analysis looking at, well, what would the costs and savings be in a situation if LCFS credits no longer existed? Because as we've said before, we can't guarantee what changes, if any, may happen with that program or what the market value of those credits may be.
Okay, so the next question from Mark Feynman from 10:16 a.m. Could you post the meeting documents, the current draft markup of the rule like you did in July? And so that is something we're going to work on and try to get out in the next couple months, some draft regulatory language with kind of the updated concepts we presented today. So thank you, Mark.
Okay, and I can take Steve Post's comment, which is, will the forklifts have to be electric, or will companies be able to use non-electric forklifts as long as they are zero emission? As stakeholders, we don't want to limit ourselves only to electric if other zero emission energy sources become available in the future. Yes, for sure. So the way we've structured this proposal is it would just be a phase out of your affected spark ignition forklifts. We don't have anything in there that's saying you must purchase zero emission forklifts or you must purchase battery forklifts or anything like that. So it's just a phase out. And however, if you can get your work done without forklifts, or you want to use fuel cell forklifts or battery forklifts or whatever, that would all be possible approaches that would be totally compliant with our proposal.
And so Holmes, I think you claimed this next question from Mary Alyssa Rancier. Is that for us to respond to? I'm guessing so. So I guess I'll take that one. Mary Alyssa Rancier from 1023 asks, while some forklifts may be parked outside, please confirm that settings in which it is feasible, our members leave their equipment on remote construction sites for months, years, depending on the length of the project, and will be exposed to all these elements. Can they handle those conditions without a roof covered space? If so, there needs to be some reassurances that this is the case and to have some exemptions in case this turns out not to be true. Yeah, so this will be something we follow up with manufacturers on. From what we understand, they can be parked outside, or there are models that can be. I don't know like what limitations there are to that. So I don't know if it's different if they park months or years outside. So anyways, we'll follow up with manufacturers on your question. Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, David, I would only add to that it would also be construction permit dependent as well, whatever the conditions of that permit are, as far as whether or not a cover is required.
Thank you.
David,
next question. Yeah, sorry. Matthew Hall from 1027, the July 2022 draft removed time limitations for rental. Is that still true? Yes. And so you can rent as long as the model year of the forklift you're renting has not been phased out yet, but there is no limitation on how long you can rent that forklift. I guess I'll just read this one and see who wants to respond. Joel Baxter from 10:30 a.m. Has consideration been made for 24/7 facilities that operate continuously, where charging times will limit the operating times of electric forklifts compared to the continuous operating ability of propane? We understand the batteries in our existing electric forklifts are very heavy and must be charged in the forklifts. We're concerned we will have to increase the number of forklifts in our fleet to meet the operating capability of our existing propane fleet. So, I mean, what we're hearing is that there have been a lot of advances in battery technology. In particular, it's like lithium ion technology is one technology that we keep hearing can do these multi-shift operations, because they're able to charge much more quickly, that you can opportunity charge them. Assuming you got a larger fleet, it seems like fuel cells could also be an option. It seems like, if you're just talking about lead acid, yeah, we understand that at least traditional lead acid technology probably wouldn't work that well in a multi-shift operation. But given kind of the recent advances of battery technology and the availability of fuel cells, there are solutions that can do that. So thank you. Thank you, Joel.
Okay, I'll take the next one. Regina Sue at 1031 offered a comment, which is thank you to staff for working on this rule. You're welcome. It was helpful to get an update on the technology status and availability of ZE forklifts and the progress that has been made. This sector is ripe for electrification, but the estimated public benefits also show we need to pick up the pace and why the rule is necessary. The current draft reg concept is feasible and offers significant flexibility and takes into account the potential need for compliance extensions. Thank you. And then at 1036, Sam Horlick asked, where's the best place to get started with the LCFS program? They have a website, which I will write in I'll put the link in as a written response to this question. But if you just Google search CARB LCFS, you'll find it.
And Sam, if you have any issues finding it, please reach out to us directly and we'll put you in touch with them if you have trouble. Thank you. Next question from Brandon Craighead from 10:36 a.m. Addressing the climate issue you're referring to would be to hold all countries accountable. In order to fully become zero emission, the energy utilized would need to come from a renewable source. If coal plants, natural gas are producing majority of the electricity, would it be in the states as well as the business's best interest if requiring zero emission equipment were pushed back until a better alternative and reliable source of electricity is constructed? In terms of holding other countries accountable, that's like way over my head. Sorry, I can't really address that. But in terms of like our own grid, right? We have our own kind of targets. I think instead of kind of doing them in sequence, what we're doing, because our aggressors are so target, a lot of these kind of efforts are kind of happening in parallel and concurrently. So, you know, in addition to that kind of these efforts to clean up and go zero with mobile sources, there's also efforts going on to kind of clean up our grid, which I believe our grid is actually not too bad at this point, but there are additional, there are other future goals that's only going to make it cleaner.
Yeah, also, I'd like to add that Cal ISO has stated that certain days in the summer, California's energy grid is operating on over 90% solar or renewable power. So we're getting there. It's happening. It's just happening, you know, slowly. Solar takes a lot of time to build out. And same thing with the wind. My understanding is they're also proposing several large wind farms off the coast of California. And since solar doesn't generate at night and wind tends to be higher at night, the two complement each other. So I think eventually we'll get there. It just will take a little more time, but postponing it wouldn't be a good idea because progress is being made every day in the power generation.
Thank you, Keith. And the state's operating under some very aggressive targets for cleaning up the grid even further. Okay, so the next question is from Mark Betancourt, 10:40 a.m. We were told by our service provider that 2 of our forklifts are out of regulation. And I've looked through the CARB website to find that reg, but I can't find it. I'm trying to propose purchasing new. So we'll respond to you privately. What they're referring to, I believe, is the existing LSI, CARB's existing LSI regulation, which did require phase out of older, dirtier forklifts. And so probably a couple of years slipped through the cracks, but we'll reach out privately. And you provided some details here that I don't want to read out loud.
Okay, Greg Stevenson from 1045 asks, looking at slide 43, ED visits are about half of the 845 fatalities. Compare these numbers to California drug stats from 2021. There were 7,175 overdose deaths and about 3 times as many ED visits as what is ED? Hold on, let me go find out what ED stands for.
Emergency department, probably.
Emergency department, yeah. Visits at 21,016. What is your confidence in these estimates? And are these estimates important to your decision making? So This is incorporated into our cost analysis. So these numbers actually were run by our research division. And so we online today are really not the experts to respond to how these numbers were derived. But next to the numbers, there is like a confidence interval. So for each of the different outcomes. And so, but if you have specific questions about this, maybe you can send it to us in the Zero-Emission Forklift email address, and we can redirect that to forward that to our research division folks.
I can add on that we follow a US EPA sort of procedure that many people use and has been used for many years. So we're quite confident in the methodology we use. I can also add that it's definitely a very conservative estimate of the health benefits associated with the emission reductions that we expect from this measure. It currently only sort of gives us quote credit for health benefits from reducing secondary particulate matter that come from the NOx reductions. But of course, there's all kinds of other benefits you get. If you reduce NOx, it cuts ozone pollution, for example, and that causes all kinds of asthma attacks and heart issues and stuff. So there's actually a effort underway at CARB right now to do a better job of more thoroughly quantifying those additional health endpoints. So if anything, the health estimates, health benefit estimates that we have are likely to be higher in the future. But thanks for the question.
Okay, so next question here is from Tom Scheller from 10:46 a.m. We have just one 3,000-pound propane powered lift is exempt from all the requirements, ? Or is there some date that we must have an electric lift? And so, yeah, you would eventually have to go electric with that forklift. This rule applies to all forklifts 12,000 pounds lift capacity and less. If it's a low use and you are a micro business, you could potentially keep it indefinitely, as long as you're using it for less than 200 hours a year and you are a micro business. So meaning that you make, you take less than 25, you have less than 25 employees and you have less than $5 million in annual gross receipts. But otherwise, yes, the rule concept right now would require you to go zero.
It would require you to phase out your spark ignition forklift. And then how you handle the job is up to you.
Yeah.
Okay, Bob Shepard at 10:50 asks, in follow-up to Daniel Curtin's comment, I reiterate the terrain and environment must be a consideration. Refer to the CAT letter to see what was suggested for a rough terrain definition, where feasibility and safety must be a consideration when a Class 5 forklift is used and where an electric forklift is infeasible. Yeah, we're definitely open to some exemptions where electric won't currently work. So thank you for the comment, Bob. Then Brian Harris at 10:55 says, we use LCF credits with many customers and we have for 3 years. This is a moving market and has dropped in value by half in the last 2 years. This is not a guarantee, but a possible savings as long as the carbon producers are required to buy credits to meet their neutral position. Pine Spire is an LCFS company that might be good to reach out to for more detailed information and functionality in real life experience. Thank you. I bet that recommendation will be helpful to some of the forklift owners listening today. Thank you.
James Simonelli from 10:55 a.m. asked, the metal sector also has concern with how terrain is defined. As an example, a metal recycling facility uses forklifts outdoors and indoors. Moreover, the terrain, quote unquote, includes metal material that can puncture a battery. This is both an operational and safety concern since batteries react differently than traditional forklifts. Further discussion on terrain is appreciated. Thank you, James. Thank you, James. And so, yeah, so when we say rough terrain, we're really referring to a specific class of forklift, a Class 7 forklift, but it seems like there's a few comments today about having to define terrain, and I'm not sure if that's what we're going to do, but it seems like there is an issue here that we need to address, maybe under the potential feasibility extension or something like that. So, yeah, we look forward to talking to you, James, maybe after this workshop to kind of, like I said, do a deeper dive on what you're talking about. I know we've had some discussions already with some metal facilities, but we'll continue having those discussions to figure out how to address this. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, and definitely anyone who's hearing what we're proposing and wondering, will my specific situation where I think an electric won't work, will that be handled? Any exemptions? Please reach out to us personally, because we may not be aware of every unique operational situation that the way someone's currently using a spark ignition forklift. So please talk to us. Okay, Sam Horlick asked, will LCFS credits discontinue at the end of the phase out in 2035? To be determined. So please follow the LCFS rulemaking process. That's a whole separate process, and they haven't determined how or if they're changing those.
Daniel Langmaid from 1058 states, incentive funding may be available from local air districts. However, it's better to inquire about this as early as possible to maximize opportunities. Many programs purchase future emissions offset before it's required. Infrastructure funding may be available as well. So thank you for that comment, Daniel, that information.
Jennifer McMullen writes, what is considered a small fleet? A small fleet is a fleet of 25 or fewer forklifts, and that includes both LSI and electric forklifts.
Okay, so Thomas Baker from 11:01 a.m. asks, is there a buyback program for forklifts being phased out like cash for clunkers? I would say, so no, there isn't, I guess, a quote unquote buyback program, but like if you, before it required, if you were able to access the Carl Moyer program, for example, you could replace an internal combustion with a zero emission forklift. But you need to consult with your local air district to see if you can get that funded. Thank you. I don't know, Holmes, is there anything you would like to add on that one?
No, just Carl Moyer program, community air protection program, CORE. There's incentive programs available for consideration out there. Carl Moyer and CAP are going to have a scrap requirement, but they are implemented by the air districts. So Dave, you captured that right. You need to reach out to the air district.
Thanks, Holmes. Colin, sorry if I get your name wrong here, Suirez asked at 11:03 a.m. what is the useful life of battery by type in ZEV forklifts, and is the cost to replace calculated in the model? And so I'm going to ask Lori if you have available. Do you have our assumptions in terms of the battery life? Sorry to put you on the spot if you have it.
Okay, yes, this is Laura. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, we did include replacement cost for lead acid battery, but not for lithium ion in our cost assessment. These are our preliminary cost assessment, and we will actually be updating that assessment when we work on our staff report.
Okay, so we'll have like a useful life assumption in there. And as Lori said, that during the life of a forklift, our assumption is that there will be a replacement of the lead acid battery pack, but we're assuming that at least for the life of the forklift, our assumption, I think, is might be 13 years at this point, I think, that the lithium ion battery would last just as long as the forklift itself. Okay. If you have any other questions on that, Colin, please reach out to us individually, separately. Thanks. Thank you. Mary Alyssa Rancier at 11:06 a.m. asks, how will CARB handle the recycling of batteries, especially as more electric equipment is required? Currently, there are no recycle plants in California that handle zero-emission batteries, and only about 5 plants in the entire country. So, I mean, we're not going to be directly involved in that, but what we've been hearing from manufacturers is that, you know, they're all kind of starting to institute either recycling or recapture programs where they can repurpose the batteries for other things, such as like these local battery storage boxes and maybe mobile power units and stuff like that. So as far as we know, that as far as we're hearing from manufacturers, most of them have plans to kind of recapture those batteries, either to recycle or to repurpose. But ARB, we would not be directly involved in that. Thank you. Okay, we do have a raised hand here. Did we want to take that? And then come back to the written ones after? Okay, why don't we take that, Marjorie?
Okay, we have a raised hand from Priscilla Rodriguez. Priscilla, I have unmuted your mic. Please state your name and your affiliation.
Hi, Priscilla Rodriguez again with Western Ag Processors and California Cotton Ginners and Growers Associations. I wanted to provide some comments, David, on slides 44 and 45, where you talked about the return on investment examples. There's a couple things that want to take you to consideration. Is one of them the infrastructure installations. I know there was a comment made earlier about the cost of that and possibly not being reflective of what the actual cost would be. I'm not sure where that number comes from, or if it includes what some facility upgrade costs will be. I know a lot of our membership and in rural areas more specifically will have to have facility upgrades. So I think it's important to take that into consideration. From our membership alone, folks that have looked into it already, you're talking about hundreds and thousands to millions of dollars in facility upgrades to be able to support the charging infrastructure, to support the infrastructure for electric forklifts. Another thing to take into consideration is on that, I know it was mentioned as well earlier on the 18 cents, and David, I think you recognize that some folks pay more for that and somewhere in the range of double of that.
Right.
That's another thing that should be also taken into consideration, especially for agriculture, because we are on the higher end of that. So that would change the return of investment for us, especially when you consider double the cost for electric rates. And then the other thing, because most of our operations are seasonal, they run 3 to 4 months out of the year, they're running 24 hours a day. It's not a one-to-one conversion. You can't use one electric forklift or replace one electric forklift for one propane forklift because of the 24-hour operations. You have to have one extra forklift per one that you convert over, just because it would need to be charging while you're using the second electric forklift. So I think that also needs to be taken into consideration. It's not a one-for-one when you're converting over when you have a 24-hour operation. So those are just some of the comments that I wanted to add to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Priscilla. Yeah, we know about the rates, especially in rural communities. We are aware of that. And on the infrastructure costs, I think we can have further discussions, but I think the number that we have was like a survey of a large number of projects, and that document, don't have the name of it right on the top of my head, but it was it will be cited in our SRIA. But we do understand that infrastructure is it's highly variable in terms of the cost. My staff just clarified, it was a ICCT report that looked at the installation of light duty, basically level 2 chargers across the state, and it was like the best resource we had. And ICCT stands for what? The International Council on Clean Transportation or something. I think that's what it was. So that was the report we referenced. But we're willing to continue talking with you about the infrastructure costs. I know another question, right, is AB 841 and how that how that affects companies or facilities at the end of an end of a circuit and stuff like that, and might be different than if you're in the middle of a circuit. And so we'll continue kind of investigating those, and I look forward to kind of continue discussions on that. And then on the one comment about the seasonal use of forklifts, do you know at this point, whether lithium ion technology would resolve some of those issues, or what we've been hearing is the lithium ion technology can handle multiple shifts much faster to charge. Of course, you still need the infrastructure upgrades to do that, to be able to charge all those, but
from what I'm hearing, David, that they certainly work better, but you still have the downtime from charging, and especially on a 24-hour operation, it still poses challenges.
Okay, well, we'll continue to talk about that after this meeting. And we'll to assess that. Well, thank you. So,
I had a question for Priscilla. Do you have the specifics on some of those really expensive upgrades on the facility side of the meter? curious to know what the costs are involved with that, like what items needed to be upgraded to cost, say, $1 million.
I don't have it with me, but I can definitely share that with you and the CARB staff. And there's a couple other case studies that we have where we have those price breakdowns. So I can definitely share that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Priscilla. We can go back to written questions.
I can
Okay.
read a question from Scott Bush from 1115, who asks, if I only own one forklift, am I allowed to use the low use exemption? Or do I need to own 10 to be able to use the exemption because it's 10%? The ACF purchasing requirements expose this issue, which needs clarification. Keith, would you like to answer?
Yes, if you are a micro business, or any business for that matter, you don't need to have 10 forklifts. You could have one low use, providing again, it's below 200 hours per year. However, if you are not a micro business, you would have to phase them out or get rid of it starting in 2031. But if you are a micro business, that exemption extends indefinitely.
Thank you, Keith. And then at 1118, Daniel Langmaid said, for help with emergency information and operations, I recommend reaching out to the California State Emergency Management Agency, Cal OES, and the Region 9 federal one, FEMA Region 9. They will probably have a good idea. Thank you, we will.
Sorry, it's muted. Michelle Watson from 11:21 a.m. asks, are there any types of incentives currently from converting LP powered forklifts to electric? If so, where do we go? And so there are a number of different incentive programs that we have that targeting mobile sources here in California. Many of them are administered by by local air districts, such as the CARB program, the Community Air Protection Program. And so I would say, I would suggest that you talk to your local air district to see if there are any incentives available there. We also have a state incentive program, the Clean Off-Road Equipment Voucher Incentive Project. That program right now is like tentatively closed. It will reopen probably in the next few months, but forklifts are of eligible category in that program, and they don't require scrap. Currently, the program only applies to forklifts that have an 8,000 pound lift capacity or greater. But that's what it is at this point. So yeah, I mean, if you're interested in that, you can reach out to me. I can forward you to the right folks, but also please reach out to your local air districts to see what else is available there. Thank you.
Okay, Andrew Barron asks if an EV retrofit, instead of replacing a forklift, would an EV retrofit qualify? And if so, would it need to be certified via the aftermarket parts regulations? Yeah, as long as you get rid of the spark ignition forklift, it would qualify. However, you are absolutely right that there are currently some requirements under our aftermarket program to prevent like tampering that you have to be cognizant of and compliant with. Thank you for that suggestion. And then Christine Campbell says, for your consideration, the definition of an emergency situation from our air permits is an emergency situation is an unscheduled event caused by suddenly and reasonably unforeseen natural disasters or suddenly and reasonably unforeseen events beyond the control of the permittee. It would seem reasonable to apply this definition to the regulation and not require a statewide declaration. You could require a facility to keep a record of emergency use. Thanks for the suggestion. David?
Which one are we on right now? The Jason
Smith.
Jason Smith. Okay, Jason Smith asked at 11:24 a.m. Is there an estimate on how much energy rates will increase due to energy companies having to update infrastructure, and how will that affect the ROI of going electric? And so, energy rates is not something ARB projects. We go by the California Energy Commission's rate forecast, which it's a very complicated calculus that takes into a lot of different things, not just the the regulations that we're adopting here as CARB, but also like, just general hardening of the grid and bearing lines, stuff like that. And so so what we're doing is we're working very closely with the Energy Commission to ensure they have the information from our policies, and they're incorporating them into their forecasts. But we rely on the California Energy Commission's forecast for our energy rate assumptions.
Okay, thanks, David. Michelle Watson asks, after the life of a lithium battery, how do you plan on disposing and scrapping the lithium battery? And that's a really good question. So it is important to properly recycle lithium batteries after they've been used. There's currently a system of how those batteries from household products are handled via household hazardous waste pickup places. But as the state transitions to a lot more electric equipment powered by lithium ion batteries, like many light duty cars powered by lithium ion batteries, there's a lot of thinking going into making sure that battery recycling can ramp up to meet the need. And so, in fact, Cali PA currently has an advisory group going on that issue. So if you're interested in digging into more on that, I suggest looking into that advisory group, which you can just Google Cali PA Lithium Ion Car Battery Recycling Advisory Group. So thanks for pointing out that issue. And that definitely is one of the environmental issues that we'll need to address when we look at the overall environmental review for this rulemaking. And then Raul Franco asks, who is responsible for fleet reporting if you lease your fleet? As David Chen mentioned earlier, we're trying to limit reporting within this regulation to the minimum that's required to make sure that we can implement and enforce the rules. So there isn't a lot of reporting. And as long as you have a model year that a forklift that's legal to use, it's not one of the older ones that's already been required to be phased out, there's no reporting required. But as far as when reporting is required, we are still working on the details of how that would work and whether we do it like some other regulations do it and say, well, if you lease for a year or more, then any reporting is your responsibility. Whereas for a very short-term rental, it's the responsibility of the rental company. So it's likely we do something like that for whatever reporting is necessary. Okay, and then Michael Malhart says, I have experience with requirements for power for electric lifts. This conversion to 480 volt fast charging would have required complete upgrade of the electrical service to the factory, costing $1.5 million in 2008. The leased lifts would have had little value. 100 lifts on rapid charge would have had significant utility impact. Uncertainty over grid reliability would potentially require total standby power for up to 8 megawatts. Who pays? Or is this situation going to be a job killer? Thank you for sharing your experience. We've actually had a really helpful and enlightening series of discussions with a bunch of ag stakeholders, a bunch of ag processing facilities that have been in a similar situation where, sometimes not only would it be super expensive to upgrade to do the necessary charging, but sometimes they're getting told by their utility, oh, I can't even provide you the required power for 3 years or 5 years. And so we're trying to be really mindful of the fact that those situations do exist. And, while we're more kind of globally working with utilities to try to long-term get these problems worked out, I want to make sure that we structure the provisions of this regulation so we never put someone in an impossible situation where they can't get the charging set up. And then as far as the cost, we definitely are looking at including costs like that, infrastructure related costs, as we examine the costs and benefits of our proposal. Thanks for sharing your experience.
I think that's it.
12:33, not too bad. I want to just extend great appreciation to the 157 people that are still online here with us. I appreciate it very much, and great questions and comments today.
Yes, thank you. And if you want to talk about anything more in more detail, please again reach out to us. You can send an email to the Zero-Emission Forklift email address, or you can use the contact information that was provided on the contact slide. Yeah, like I said, we can't, like Kim was saying, we really need your input to do a regulation that makes sense. So please reach out to us if you have something to contribute. Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I think that's it for us. Again, thank you everybody for attending.